being virtual, but I miss our face-to-face meetings, and I look forward that we get back to beautiful Fukuoka so we can all meet together again. And without further ado, Hiroshige, please move on.
Okay, thank you. I'm also expecting such a bright future for us. So, Tomoya, can you go back to the slide for the instruction of this workshop? Yes, so at the beginning of this workshop, I'd like to tell you something. So this not webinar, but this workshop will be recorded and made available on the I2CNER website later. So if you do not wish to appear in the video, please turn off your video. Please mute yourself on entry. And the most important thing is that during the Q&A session, please use raise hand function. Please push the button of raise hand so that the chair can find you and ask you to have some questions, and then the Q&A will be possible. This is simple instruction for this thrust workshop. Okay. And in this case, we can go to the first session of AES thrust. So Masanobu,
Okay, can you hear me?
start. Yes.
Okay, so let me start sharing screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, so hello, I'm Masanobu Kubota, lead principal investigator and professor at Advanced Energy Materials Trust, I2CNER. I'd like to welcome you all and thank everyone for joining to I2CNER Trust Workshop. First three presentations are going to be made by Advanced Energy Materials Trust. I will chair this session. The first speaker is me. One that I2CNER strongly press forward is international collaboration. Then I decided to speak about collaboration with University of Göttingen, Germany, for the research study on the mitigation of hydrogen embrittlement by impurities. Professor Petros Sophronis, Ryosuke Komoda, Lin Tian, Cynthia Folkart, Rainer Kirchheim also take part in this project. I will share the allocated time with Dr. Lin Tian. Okay. あら、切り替わらない。Sorry. Prior to the scientific talk, please allow me to introduce Advanced Energy Materials Trust. The objective is to develop molecular, nano, and bulk material based on new science of surface, interfaces, and microstructures for the applications involving hydrogen, water, and carbon dioxide. Our activities are roughly classified into two categories, which are catalytic materials and structural materials. The thrust just began this year, so I hope we can further develop interdisciplinary research by fusion of research areas in the future. Okay. So this is the outline of this presentation. I'm going to speak about fracture toughness test done in I2CNER, and Dr. Tian will speak about observation of microstructure done in University of Göttingen. We have very nice facilities for hydrogen embrittlement experiment, and University of Göttingen have many advanced instruments for material characterization. So this is one of the reasons that we have collaboration. Okay, so as you may know, many kinds of steels and alloys are used in the hydrogen chain. Stainless steel, low carbon steel, chromoly steel, and other materials are necessary. The point is that these materials, strength of these materials is degraded by hydrogen. We call this degradation hydrogen embrittlement. As you can see here, there are pipelines. Nitrogen gas and natural gas are transported by this kind of facilities. However, if the media is hydrogen, we need a special pipeline because of hydrogen embrittlement. If hydrogen embrittlement is mitigated by just adding small amount of impurities to hydrogen, we don't need to construct a new pipeline. It brings huge cost benefit. The objective of this study is to characterize the mitigation of hydrogen embrittlement by ammonia. Regarding other impurities such as oxygen and carbon monoxide, we already have several papers. Let me explain our strategy to mitigate hydrogen embrittlement by impurities. This is a beginning of hydrogen embrittlement. There are many hydrogen embrittlement mechanisms, but all mechanisms require hydrogen uptake. Hydrogen molecule approaches to the iron surface, and they have chemical and physical interaction with each other. Hydrogen-hydrogen bonding in the hydrogen molecule is stable and strong, but Fe surface helps dissociation of hydrogen molecule into hydrogen atoms by its catalytic function. As a result, hydrogen uptake occurs and it leads hydrogen embrittlement. On the other hand, if impurity is mixed to hydrogen gas, and the impurity has stronger affinity with iron surface than hydrogen molecule, the impurities occupies reaction site, and this impurity collect electrons, which supposed to be donated to hydrogen molecule. So the catalytic activity of Fe surface is deactivated. So hydrogen uptake is prevented, and it leads no hydrogen embrittlement. We carried out a fracture toughness test. With these conditions, the material was SCM440 chromoly steel, and the environment was hydrogen, nitrogen, hydrogen plus ammonia, and nitrogen plus ammonia. The loading rate is one of the important variables for the hydrogen embrittlement experiment, so we used two loading rate, 2 times 10 to the minus third and 10 to the minus fifth millimeter per second. The temperature was 293 Kelvin, and the gas pressure at which the fracture toughness test was carried out was 0.1 megapascal in gauge pressure. So this is a result of the fracture toughness test with a higher loading rate. The explanation of the graph is a little complicated within limited time. So I'd like to explain the result based on the J1C fracture toughness value. So please look at this bar graph. In hydrogen, the fracture toughness value was significantly reduced. In other words, hydrogen embrittlement occurred. In hydrogen plus ammonia, the fracture toughness value was almost the same as that in nitrogen. So we confirmed the mitigation by NH3. And in the nitrogen plus NH3 environment, the fracture toughness value was almost similar, same as that in nitrogen. So in this case, NH3 had no effect on the fracture toughness of this material under the given experimental conditions. Next, I'd like to show you the result with lower loading rate. The curves in the graph, except for the curve of nitrogen, changed. Regarding the fracture toughness value in hydrogen, the reduction was more significant. We can find a similar trend in other hydrogen embrittlement experiments. The reason why the effect of hydrogen is more pronounced with a decrease in the loading rate is that more time for hydrogen uptake and hydrogen diffusion is provided by the reduced loading rate. Regarding the mitigation of hydrogen embrittlement by ammonia, the effect was greatly reduced. What is most interesting in this experiment is the result obtained in nitrogen plus ammonia environment. The J1C fracture toughness value was significantly reduced, while ammonia had no effect in the previous experiment. So to clarify the mechanism of these results, we observed fracture surface. In nitrogen, it shows dimple fracture surface. This is a representative feature that the material causes fracture in a ductile manner. The fracture surface in hydrogen shows quasi-cleavage. Hydrogen changed the way of crack propagation. Quasi-cleavage is also a representative feature of hydrogen embrittlement. So as you remember, in hydrogen plus ammonia with faster loading rate, the hydrogen embrittlement is mitigated. The fracture surface showed dimple. So we confirmed that ammonia prevented hydrogen uptake. And this fracture surface is obtained in nitrogen plus ammonia with lower loading rate. As you remember, J1C value was significantly lowered. In this case, the fracture surface shows quasi-cleavage. So this observation showed hydrogen embrittlement occurred in this environment in spite of the fact that the gas didn't contain hydrogen. Regarding the mechanism that NH3 mitigated the hydrogen embrittlement, we already confirmed the NH3 has higher affinity with Fe surface. Adsorption of NH3 on the Fe surface hindered the interaction between hydrogen and Fe surface. As a result, hydrogen uptake is suppressed. Eventually, hydrogen embrittlement was mitigated. Regarding the mechanism that NH3 had no effect when the loading rate is high and caused hydrogen embrittlement when the loading rate was low. We considered the composition of NH3 into NH2 plus hydrogen by the help of Fe catalyst. We think this decomposition may be time-consuming process. Then the effect of this reaction didn't appear when the loading rate was high. In addition, we can think different story. According to the previous study on CO, we clarified that CO can cover only 70% of Fe surface. When CO adsorbs on the Fe surface, this CO collects electrons from Fe surface. As a result, electron poor site is created around a CO molecule. Other CO molecules are no longer able to adsorb on this electron poor site. The point is the hydrogen molecule can access to this electron poor site. It means that hydrogen uptake occurred, but the amount of hydrogen goes into the material is reduced. Therefore, a long time is needed to cause hydrogen embrittlement. If the time is short, the amount of hydrogen is not sufficient to cause hydrogen embrittlement. Regarding the mechanism that mitigation of hydrogen embrittlement by NH3 was reduced at lower loading rate, similar mechanism, NH3 decomposition and incomplete NH3 coverage can be considered. Conclusion, to characterize the mitigation of hydrogen embrittlement by NH3, fracture toughness test of SCM440 steel was carried out. NH3 had both functions of hydrogen embrittlement mitigator and hydrogen embrittlement inducer. So that's all for now. Thank you for your attention. Later, I will welcome your questions. So, Dr. Tian, are you there? Are you ready?
Yeah.
So
Can
please,
you hear me?
yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great.
Great.
So now I will show my slide here. Sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. It's my great honor to be here joining this workshop, and I'm really happy to share with you the progress in our investigation of hydrogen embrittlement using our environmental TEM. So work is only possible through the collaboration between Institute for Material Physics in University of Göttingen and I2CNER. So I will start my talk with this image of our equipment, the environmental TEM, which allows us to investigate material with gas environment. So currently, I hope you can see my the mouse arrow here. So this is fine. So currently we are using these several gases or some mixture of them. And with a empty gas line, it's also possible to let in other gases such as ammonia in the future. And using the TEM, we can do in situ crack test inside TEM and observe the deformation process in the microstructure. And we can use either vacuum or the gas system, gas environment. So the material is the same as Professor Kubota just mentioned, but we choose a material that is with a higher tempering temperature, which result in a softer material. You can see the strength and hardness all decrease, and also the elongation, the ductility increase. The reason that we choose a more ductile material is to hoping to see a more significant change when hydrogen embrittlement occurs. And so the microstructure of the material consists of ferrite matrix with the grain size about 1 micron and with some cementite precipitates in it. For making the in situ fracture test, so we cut the sample using focused ion beam. First, we cut a big piece of material with the size about 10 micron, and then further thin the center part to make it electron transparent. The thickness is about 150 nanometers. So we leave 2 big pillars outside and for taking the fracture test. So inside a TEM, we use a wedge-shaped tungsten tip to, if we move it downward, and then they will push these 2 pillars again away from each other, and then that will create stress on this thin part in the middle. So on the right, I show you this TEM bright field image of a sample that we tested. So we can still see the microstructures and also the particles and even some dislocations during deformation. For the crack here, this is also cut by focused ion beam to create a preferential site for the crack nucleation. So now I come to this part. So I hope this video works well. So you can see the videos, right? Okay, good. So now I show you the video showing the crack formation process in 2 samples. One is tested with 2 millibar hydrogen gas and one in vacuum. So in this video, so it's mostly dark and white, black and white. So I increased the contrast of video to better show the formation of the crack, such as here, and also void formation in the video on the right side. So I have to mention that even though you cannot see the microstructure here, but we checked all the deformation. Most of the deformation occurs mainly in the ferrite matrix. So this is due to the reason that the TEM sample is really very thin and it's in low triaxiality stress state. However, with the same low triaxiality stress state, we still see this hydrogen-induced very distinct, very different deformation behavior here. So with hydrogen gas, we see nano cracks formation and then connect and propagate. But without hydrogen, just in vacuum, so we see void nucleation and then coalesce. We can then check the post-mortem SEM images of the sample, but maybe with first impression, you don't really see much of the differences. So I think in this part, it also emphasized the importance to take the in situ experiment to see how the crack really nucleate. So here I show you several images of during the deformation process, and in the hydrogen embrittlement case, so we see the zigzag cracks, or this is rectangle staircase-like shape of the crack. So if we see the 2 sides of the profile of the fracture surface, we see them, they almost overlap with each other, indicating the plasticity is really limited. So this is not happening in the case we test the sample in vacuum. Here we see pretty large deformation in the material. So back to the steps. So we measure the steps. So the size is around several tens of nanometers to 100 nanometers. If we look closer to the steps, we can also take high resolution images of the steps here. And it shows most of the steps shows this is 100 facets, which also explains why the steps is a right angle staircase shape. So this 100 facets. So here I would like to propose a mechanism how this 100 facets is coming up. So this is related to 100 dislocations. We know that in BCC materials, also most of the dislocations is in 111 type. But during deformation, the 111 types, 111 types dislocation could form this reaction and create this 100 type dislocation. So even in our TEM samples, I can find 100 type dislocations showing here in this high resolution TEM image. And this figure here shows how the reaction takes on. Comparing to the 101 type dislocation, 100 dislocation has a larger space at the dislocation core, simply because it has a larger Brooks factor. And I suppose that if we have this larger space at the dislocation core of such type of dislocation, it might attract the hydrogen atom. And with this hydrogen atom here, so the dislocation might become less mobile, and with the strain accumulate, this size could lead to the nucleation of cracks, and as eventually it will lead to the step-like crack with 100 facets. To summarize what we have done in our TEM experiment, we have seen clearly different fracture behavior in samples tested with hydrogen gas and without hydrogen gas. And it is suggested that the hydrogen embrittlement, it occurs through the brittle fracture cleavage on the 100 planes. So our plan for the future is to measure the strain around a 100 dislocation and to see how that it will evolve with hydrogen charging. So that's all for from my part, from my result, and I would like to have further discussion with you. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Very interesting talk. So we have 2 minutes for Q&A. So please raise hand if you have a question or a comment. Please, Cynthia, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question to Professor Kubota.
Okay.
Which is, you talked about, I guess I'm wondering whether it is important to know whether the effect of these gases on
Yes.
the embrittlement or impeding the effect of the hydrogen, whether this is purely geometric or whether the electronic effects are also important. Is it important that we know this difference, or does it just matter that it works? Well, maybe my question isn't clear, but is it important, for instance, in the case of ammonia, to know whether it's a geometrical blocking of the reactant sites or whether it's a change in the electronic
Yes.
properties that's important?
Yes, certainly we need to understand how ammonia works to prevent hydrogen uptake. So actually, we have another collaborator, Professor Steikov. He may help us by the DFT calculation or molecular dynamics simulations. So we can argue the electronic state of the ammonia on the Fe surface.
Masanobu, is Alex here?
Probably. Alex?
Yes,
Are
I'm
you
here.
there?
Can you hear me? Yes, that's right. Actually, at the moment, we are performing this calculation with a PhD student of Professor Kubota. The ammonia interaction with iron surface is the opposite process of Hubbard-Bosch process, where ammonia is being synthesized from hydrogen and nitrogen. So it is a very well-known process in chemistry. And at the moment, we are investigating the reverse reaction, the ammonia decomposition on the surface. So there is the decomposition rate, which is very important. And our plan is to calculate this rate constant so that we see what is the speed of the rate of the ammonia decomposition, which would be related with the rate which Professor Kubota is testing. Electronic interaction would be quite important. So what ammonia is doing is not just blocking sites, but it's actually providing different species. So once ammonia decomposes, from ammonia to hydrogen, it is ammonia to amino group and hydrogen. Now amino group binds much stronger to the iron surface, and it's withdrawing much more electron density from the iron surface. So there are a lot of things to investigate, and it's quite interesting. So the PhD student of Professor Kubota is working pretty well on this, and I hope soon we will provide results about that.
Thank you, Alex.
May I ask a further part to that question or a comment?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, that's very, very interesting. And I brought, of course, we would like to, in the TEM measurements that Lynn spoke about, experiments, we would like to then, of course, as she mentioned at the beginning, introduce additional gases to test exactly the work that Professor Kubota is doing. One thing we could conceivably do in our TEM is with the use of eels, is to look to see whether we're changing the electronic properties near the surface. So I think this is an interesting thing for us to think about and see whether this would be useful for comparing with the MD simulations and the DFT simulation.
For me, this will be amazingly useful. I would love to see such an experimental support. It would be amazing.
Alex, you can turn on your camera. Unless you do not like to show your face in the recording.
Sure. No, sure. Just a second. Yes.
Cynthia, indeed, I think indeed. Yeah. Let me compare here. If you could do that, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Masanobu, can I ask Lynn a question?
In a short time.
Yes, perhaps a comment. Lynn, thank you for your presentation. It was lucid, clear, and straightforward. Thank you for your work here. Have you, at the intersection, did you manage to see an initiation of a nanovoid there? Did you manage to see anything where the two slip lanes meet?
So the answer will be currently not yet. So to really see the slip plane, you really need the right orientation. Well, this is a multi-grain sample with, so you never know that you will have that. So that will need a more dedicated design for the experiment.
But I think your story fits to the general understanding that we have about hydrogen. I think it really, thank you. And it was very well presented. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's time to move our next speaker. So let's thank Dr. Tian again. Okay, next speaker is Takashi Fukushima from I2CNER. Are you there? Okay, good. Please show us your slide. Okay, the title of his presentation is Electrosynthesis of Amino Acids from Sustainable Feedstock. Dr. Fukushima, I'm sorry, but you have only 10 minutes, so please go ahead.
Thank you for your kind attention, kind introduction. I'd like to thank you to have this opportunity to give this presentation today. I'd like to talk about electrosynthesis of amino acids from sustainable feedstock. In recent years, most of amino acids are manufactured by two methods presented here. One is the fermentation of sugarcane juice and the other is chemical synthesis. However, fermentation method has drawbacks such as high energy consumption of microbial culture and food-based feedstock. And the chemical method uses highly toxic reagents such as cyanides. On the other hand, reductive amination of alpha-fatty acid has advantages such as disuse of highly toxic reagent. Furthermore, if the imine and oxygen reduction proceeds electrochemically, we can utilize water and renewable electricity as a hydrogen and energy source, respectively. Recently, we have reported that titanium oxide ground on titanium mesh electrode catalyzes electrochemical conversion of alpha-fatty acid into corresponding amino acid in presence of hydroxylamine with remarkably high Faraday efficiency of 60 to 99%. Furthermore, we also tried continuous electrosynthesis of alanine using flow-type electrochemical reactor shown here. And we achieved maximum 72% Faraday efficiency for alanine production. As a new feedstock for amino acid, we focused on oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is one of the most ubiquitous organic acids and easily obtained from agricultural waste. Oxalic acid is not alpha-fatty acid, but we have demonstrated that titanium oxide catalyzed electrochemical reduction converts oxalic acid into gray oxalic acid. And gray oxalic acid can be converted into glycine. In this presentation, I'd like to talk about our recent efforts on developing a catalyst for one-step electrochemical conversion of oxalic acid into glycine. In this presentation, first I will describe catalytic activity test of various materials using CV to find suitable catalyst for glycine synthesis. Next, I will talk about controlled potential electron reduction of oxalic acid in the presence of hydroxylamine and optimization of reaction conditions. First, let me describe catalytic activity test. Hydroxylamine react with gray oxalic acid quantitatively, but not react with oxalic acid. Therefore, in this reaction system, free hydroxylamine exists. Thus, we have to find a catalyst which has higher activity for oxalic acid reduction and than that for hydroxylamine reduction. We tested metal foil, calcined metal foil, titanium oxide titanium mesh. We measured CVs of these materials in the presence and absence of oxalic acid and hydroxylamine. These two slides shows result of CV measurement. it can be seen that only calcined titanium foil exhibits higher catalytic activity for oxalic acid reduction than that for hydroxylamine reduction, while the other materials containing titanium oxide, titanium mesh have higher activity for hydroxylamine reduction. Therefore, we performed controlled potential experiment using calcined titanium foil. The controlled potential experiment was performed using two-compartment electrochemical cell shown here. We employed calcined titanium foil and titanium oxide titanium mesh as working electrode. This graph shows the time course of current density. Titanium oxide titanium mesh exhibits larger current density due to its high surface area. Here shows the product distribution. Glycine and its intermediate glyoxylic acid oxygen were obtained, and glycolic acid was also obtained as a byproduct. It can be seen that calcined titanium foil afforded larger Faraday efficiency for glycine and glyoxylic acid oxygen production. We thought that titanium metal covered with thin titanium oxide layer is a key structure. Thus, we prepared titanium oxide titanium mesh with thin titanium oxide layer. Using hydrothermal reaction with shortened reaction time. Then we tested performance of newly prepared electrode for glycine electrosynthesis. And it was found that thin titanium oxide titanium mesh gives large current density as the same as titanium oxide titanium mesh and high Faraday efficiency for glycine production comparable to that given by calcined titanium foil. Then we optimize the reaction condition for glycine electrosynthesis to maximize the product selectivity. We optimized the applied potential temperature, oxalic acid concentration, and pH. This slide shows results. Finally, 59% of Faraday efficiency for glycine production was achieved. Now let me summarize my talk. Catalyst which electrochemically converts oxalic acid into glycine in one step was developed. Thin titanium oxide titanium mesh was found to be a catalyst which exhibits high activity and selectivity for glycine production. By optimizing reaction conditions, high Faraday efficiency of 59% for glycine production was achieved. At last, I'd like to talk about the future perspective of our chemistry. There are many reports on selective electrochemical production of oxalic acid from carbon dioxide. Therefore, we think that electrochemical system for amino acid production from carbon dioxide can be realized. We are now developing an electrocatalytic system for glycine synthesis from carbon dioxide. Thank you for your kind attention.
So, Dr. Fukushima, thank you very much for your interesting talk. So let's open Q&A. We can accept one or two short questions. Please raise your hand. Dr. Fukushima, you said thin TiO2 and Ti mesh is good, but what is thin? How thin? what is the thickness?
Uh, in this time, we couldn't measure the thickness of titanium oxide layer, but we shortened the reaction time, so we get the thin titanium oxide layer addition here.
Okay, okay. So is there any other questions or comments?
Masanobu, can I make a question?
Yes.
I cannot find the raise hand option on my
Okay.
screen. So
Please go ahead.
so Fukushima-san, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I'm very interested in the electrosynthesis of amino acid. So you showed that only titanium dioxide is very catalytically active for the synthesis of amino acid. So in that case, what is the point, or what is the difference from of titanium dioxide electrocatalysis from all the others? What is the point? Why titanium dioxide is so successful in the electrocatalytic synthesis?
So in this reaction system, free hydroxylamine exists. So the catalyst should have a higher catalytic activity for oxalic acid reduction than that for hydroxylamine reduction. Then the other materials such as calcined nickel have larger catalytic ability to hydroxylamine reduction, but only calcined titanium foil have larger higher catalytic ability for oxalic acid. So calcined titanium foil is suitable catalyst for this reaction.
Yes, so why titanium is so suitable in comparison with others? So for example, redox activity is one parameter, and also the acid base characteristic will be another.
So so later we will research about why titanium oxide is suitable for this reaction.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice discussion. But it's time to move our next speaker. Thank you very much, Dr. Fukushima again. Okay, let me introduce our next presentation. The speaker is Professor Ki-Sek Yoon. Are you there, Yoon?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. So,
could you see my slide?
not yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
Okay, just a second. So how about?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you.
He is going to speak about biological hydrogen and carbon dioxide activation. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ki-Sek Yoon. I belong to the advanced energy material, thrust, something like that. And I'm not clearly well understood about what's the real meaning of thrust. Okay. Anyway, today I'm not talk. I want to talk about the biological reaction of the how to activate hydrogen and carbon dioxide. This is our division. Particularly, I belong to I'm work with the Professor Ogo, and we developed the bio-inspired molecular catalyst. It's for the hydrogen, the fuel and energy generation. Particularly, we also interesting about among them is particularly small molecule, hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and also water. We have a lot of study about particularly in the hydrogen, how to activate this molecule with developing the molecular catalyst using biological catalyst and the synthetic catalyst. And recently, our research highly focused on the water oxidation recently. And then, but today I wanted to talk about these 2 points, the hydrogen and the use for the electron for CO2 reduction. Okay. I'm working with usually work with the Professor Ogo. Everybody know where we developing the bio-inspired molecular system because it's very important. The natural system is very effective and high the caloric activity. So my study is for the based on the it's inspired to the synthesis reaction. So of course the Professor Ogo, he can report some other people to researchers the biochemistry, develop the enzyme reaction, but we want to know the more novel system and more updated research data. So we work together. Actually, we have around the publication, particularly some high impact journals. In my case, I also developed, the finding new, enzyme, particularly is very interesting enzyme. For example, most of case hydrogen activation enzyme we call the hydrogenase is very sensitive to oxygen, but we found some enzyme of my finding enzyme can activate the hydrogen even in presence of the oxygen. Okay, and also we have to made some here you saw the make the pure cells with our developed the enzyme is abilities better than the Pgm Catalyst. It's amazing, about 600 over the 600 times better than Pgm Catalyst. And then Professor also, based on our research, he synthesized many new type of the model complex. Okay, that is result is we have the press release and some result is the JST breakthrough news reported our study. Today, I'm focused on the particularly hydrogen and how to and CO2 reduction. Recently, I'm studying on these 2 small molecule to use for the produce of the liquid fuel. As you know, the formic acid. As you know, formic acid is quite stable liquid fuel, and it's very, important for the hydrogen carrier. And also many chemical reaction, we use the formic acid. As compared to the hydrogen, it's about around about 1,000 times the high the hydrogen content. So recently, I'm using the biocatalyst to develop these 2. I'm using these 2 biocatalysts using these two molecular activation. Also, the many researchers they developed this short hydrogenation, particularly some synthetic catalyst. It's good for robustity, but it's simple. But this is environmentally unfriendly because it's high pressure and high temperatures and high toxic and very high, costed because they use the some kind of very expensive material. On the other hand, biocatalyst is good for CO2 reduction and hydrogen production and very high catalytic activity, but problem is this is oxygen sensitive. Okay, so I'm developing the new catalyst for higher activity and the oxygen tolerance. We actually finding many new type of the biocatalysts from this in the Kyushu, particularly Kyushu National Park, the ASO around there. We screen many bacteria and many biocatalysts, and we select many special technique. The one bacteria we call the strain X77 is contain two enzyme hydrogen and formate the oxidation enzyme we call the formate dehydrogenase. It's like this. Very rapidly they can reduce methyl virogen. This is a very low redox potential artificial electron acceptors carriers, but we can use this system very easily. And then we compare the hydrogen and the formate. Hydrogen is more active enzyme, we found it. Actually, we did these two enzymes using, and then many report published here, so that here. And then we think we use this enzyme for the hydrogen activation and CO2 reduction, okay? If a little bit introduce about this enzyme, particularly the oxygen tolerant hydrogenase, we found one. It's the active site usually we call the nickel ion in content here. And then it's interesting is this enzyme, if even the oxygen environmental is changed we call the ion sulfur cluster, it changed the redox condition. They provide the electron back to the active site. It can control the activity, even present the oxygen. We demonstrate this mechanism. And then we found the format, the oxidation enzyme. This is the very active. And then the interesting is that the active site is containing molybdenum. We also this published. And then we I think if we're using this enzyme for combine these two systems, we may be, hydrogen energy, electron can show to reduction. Usually formate, they use the only formate oxidation. But this, if we well conjugate, maybe we can electron to use CO2 reduction. Because as you see here, this enzyme is very active, if just 1 hour, it's reactive, some over the week, but even the 1 hour, this QOF is very high. Right? So if we can use this system, it's very effective, application. So now I combine these two enzymes in carbon, right, and immobilize, and we have the hydrogenation and capture this enzyme, particularly like this, and then use the hydrogen and CO2, and it detected the format, make like this. We some special system. I'm not just, this is just an imaging, and then we just gas pass and then correct the liquid field. Actually, the reaction, we detected the reaction solution yearly produce formic acid. Actually, we use the enzyme assay. You can detect the formic acid. And also we detect yearly for the HPLC system, and then the formic acid can rapidly increase depending on the time. If we remove the enzyme, the reaction is stopped. And the more interesting point is this system, we added in presence of the oxygen, even oxygen containing the reaction is occurred. It's a very, very interesting point. So this result is in the submit some journal currently reviewing. And also one of the more interesting point is this reaction is just product is only formic acid, no other byproduct. We check proton NMR, carbon 13 NMR check, and then we can check the only formic acid in this reaction. And the future, I will make these two enzymes construct the real pure cell system, because gas-phase reaction is very highly active, these two systems. Okay. And some of my story, we isolate the new bacteria and growth and isolated crystal structures determined, and then the model, the process of synthesis, and we doing the application. Thank you very much. This is overlap.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Yun. Very interesting. So let's open the Q&A. Do you have questions or comments? So please raise hand. So, Dr. Yun, Professor Yun.
Hi.
So, your enzyme is extracted from bacteria.
Yes.
Is it right?
Yes.
So the most important thing is bacteria hunting. Mm-hmm. Can you design the molecule without bacteria?
Yes, I mean, okay. As you know, recently the biological system, if you the exploring the new type of the biocatalyst,
yes,
we know the many genomic information.
Yes.
So we searched among them, but even that the genome information not only sometimes not clearly, and because some enzyme is not expression. So in our case, we have the special technique for the isolation, only special bacteria. For example, high active hydrogen the enzyme or some high CO2 reduction enzyme containing bacteria, because this kind of the screening technique is the use of have to know the general microbiology knowledge, deep biology. So I made some special medium and then selection. But then we can select some special bacteria and containing the new enzyme. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to talk with you more, but we are running out of the time. So I will close this session. So thank you very much for all speakers and participants. So next chair is who? Professor Matsumoto?
Okay, thank you, Masanobu. So we will be moving on to the session 2, Advanced Energy Conversion Systems. I'm sorry we have no break to go immediately to the session 2. So session 2 is about the thrust of advanced energy conversion systems. And I'd like to show you at the beginning briefly the introduction of the thrust and advanced energy conversion systems. Advanced energy conversion systems. The purpose of this thrust is to conduct fundamental studies for the development of economically feasible energy systems characterized by high efficiency, fast conversion kinetics, and long lifetime. So we are dealing with different types of energy conversion, including electrochemical conversion, photoelectrochemical conversion, and some more energy science. So here you can see the PIs of the Advanced AECS thrust, including me, Tatsumi, Thomas, Alex, Chihaya, Kazunari, Tsuhiko, John, Harry, Andrew, Yasu, and many of them are participating to this workshop. So today we have 3 talks, one from the United States, one from UK, and one from Japan. So Professor Hong Yan is newly joined I2CNER researcher. So it is my regret, I should say hello to Hong at the beginning of this workshop. So I would like to make greeting to Hong Yan later. And also Professor Stefan Skinner is the professor of Imperial College of London. And we have great collaboration under the Core2 Core project. And Koji Takahashi is the professor of I2CNER and also the Department of Aerospace Technology in Kyushu University. And I asked Professor Fujigaya, Professor Ishihara, Professor Kono to chair each talk. And we would like to move on to Hong Yan's talk. And I'd like to ask Tsuyohiko to chair the first talk of Dr. Yan. Tsuyohiko, are you okay to start sharing the talk? Okay, so I'd like to pass the microphone to you.
Yes. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tsuyohiko Fujigaya from AEC. And I took already shower and I'm ready to go bed, but I'm excited because I never expected to meet my friend from my home. So I'm very excited. So, and also I'm very happy to introduce Professor Huang Yang. I know his name and I know his work, but this is first time to meet, introduce him. So it's very honor for me to introduce Professor Huang Yang. So please start, Professor Huang Yang. Are you ready?
Let me try to share my screen.
Okay, okay.
Let's see. All right, can you see my screen?
Oh,
now?
yes, this is very good.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank Dr. Matsumoto to invite me to this workshop. I've visited Kyushu a couple of times, but this is the first time I participate in this workshop. Luckily, it's also remotely, so I don't have to travel at this point. And it's interesting that my last visit before the COVID-19 was also visit Kyushu. So this is hopefully going to lead to some fruitful collaboration in the future. I enjoyed the previous talk very much. I can see a lot of overlap research interest. On that note, since I'm the first time joining this I2CNER workshop, I noticed I also give a little bit extra time, so I just fully utilize them and try to introduce as much as possible what we're doing in our laboratory. And using both the introduction and focus on two topics related to oxygen reduction electrocatalyst developments. So in the introduction, I'll introduce also briefly the oxygen evolution electrocatalyst development in our laboratory, and that's for the oxygen hydrogen production site. And then I move on to the oxygen reductions, and the main topics going to focus on. One is the low Pgm system, focus on the development of high density intermetallic or catalyst on carbon. And then talk about second topic related to sacrificial metal in generation of single atom based or catalysts. This is for non-Pgm system, and see how we can improve the density of single atom on carbon support. And finally, a few kind of very simple conclusion remarks. A quick introduction of my research efforts. Let me see where I quickly find the cursors. Otherwise, I'm gonna, let's see, where is that? Okay, maybe I'll just use the cursor instead of the laser. See if this works. All right, great. That works as well. And so our research area primarily focus on the nanomaterials, and that for sustainable energy applications. So currently we have a project focused on three general areas. One is on the water side, that is on the hydrogen fuel cell, both on the hydrogen production side, as well as the fuel utilization side, i.e. for the hydrogen fuel cell. We also have a project on the CO2 utilization. It's still focused on the oxygen reduction reaction catalyst development, but it's on the more on the thermal side. And lastly, we recently also initiated a collaboration with our colleagues on the high valence battery side, focus development on the magnesium battery system in particular. So because of the time and interest, I can primarily just focus on the water side for this study. And so as I promised, I'm gonna do a quick few minutes introduction of oxygen evolution catalyst developments. And we primarily focus on oxygen-based system, and two particular one that caught our eyes relate to the perovskite-based OER catalyst. That is, we try to see what happens if you have a mobile oxygen introduced, and this is involved in the oxygen deficient system. And the other type is the relatively stable system in acid. This is so-called a perchloride-based system, especially ruthenium-based. And that's another one that we have worked on recently in the laboratory. So a quick introductions. And our first publication in this space is the so-called the calcium manganese-based system, shares some similarity with the brown millerite type of structure. The key feature that we hypothesized at that point is that if we have the molecular level or atomic level oxygen vacancies, and also with a proper electronic structure on the manganese side, and that potentially could improve the reactivity, even though the major reaction center should be still on the oxygen. At that point, we speculate, and the oxygen mobility could cause the activity changes. So since our first publication in JAX in some 6-7 years ago, there actually indeed a lot of theory has been developed along this line, including the covalency theory that recently published in the Nature Catalysis last year, as well as the mobile oxygen theory also being developed. So it's all related to oxygen rather than simply rely on the metal centers. And the other research on this side is on the perchloride structure. And this was inspired by a paper published on the lithium-based batteries studies, and they record that so the pyrochloride type of prototype structure could share some stability in acid. So that's one of the reasons we screen a range of pyrochlorides, and the yttrium-based system appear to be quite stable. If you look at these, the CV cycles under the proper condition for the oxygen evolution systems, you can see by doing 1,000, 10,000 cycles, very little degradation occurs. The reference ruthenium oxide system, and they drop quite dramatically. And so if you can also look at the potential holes at the relatively low current densities, and they maintain fairly well. So this is one system we work on. And beyond the system itself, we also try to increase the surface area by creating the porosity. And one of them is using so-called porogen approach, and to create the pores while it's calcinated or the paralyzed during the conversion step. And this work published a few years ago, 2 years ago in the ongoing chemistry. Another approach is to use entrapment method to make nanoside ceramic, quote unquote, because this is an oxide after all. And so try to make that into a nanoparticle size and increase the surface area. So those are some of the effort that goes into the oxygen evolution catalyst development. I think that's relevant. I want to mention a few words before I go into today's topic. And the first one area is the low Pgm and the catalyst. Again, the most recent focus moving towards to, at least in the United States, I think it's all across the globe, is to think about the larger system and either to the medium to long range distance. So that's poses the more challenges under the catalytic development beyond the catalytic activities. For low Pgm catalysts, the method primarily focus on the platinum intermetallics, or the alloy-based structure. That's initial result come from. That's the study focus on 2 metal systems. And long story short, we have achieved quite a bit about the development based on the platinum system. And since it's the early days of the development of platinum nickel system and platinum cobalt system, and also different type of geometry being developed, and the open structure, for example, nano frame, has been developed. So the mass activity wise, and this is reached the target of the major industry companies, or the DOE, United States DOE, quite well. But there is also a problem with this type of system. This is one of the example. For instance, the nano frame, I showed it earlier, which has very high activity. But if you run this catalyst at a normal reaction condition over just, let's say, 30,000 cycles, and it's almost reduced to the level for platinum, and barely higher than the pure platinum. So that tells us a story about the need for really improve the durability, and since the activity already being quite high. In terms of rotating disk electrode system, i.e. the intrinsic performance of the catalyst. So what we try to do this day, at least one study that I'm going to share with you today, is to see what kind of stable intermetallic structure can we develop at a very ultra low features, and hopefully at a high density on the carbon support. So this particular study primarily based on the paper we recently published in Nano Energy. And one of the system we picked is the platinum cobalt as the low Pgm catalyst. And so the immediate thought behind and the approach development is see whether it can improve the density of the platinum cobalt nickel platinum cobalt catalyst on carbon support. And so this leads to us to look back one of the recent study on the synthesis of ultrafine metal and metal alloys nanoparticles. So what we have designed based on the design principle is to check whether we'll be able to tune the solution phase processing moving right around the so-called point of zero charge, and it hopefully will be able to sufficiently salvage the support carbon, and then this will be able to allow us to attract both the platinum and non-platinum based metal precursor form the hydrated layers and improve the density of the particle formation and further anchor the substrate, enter the platinum on the substrate. So this is what we actually achieved based on the simple principles by tuning the pH around the points of zero charge. If you look at this cartoon illustration, we can start to tune the particle sizes of the platinum cobalt catalyst on primarily the low pH side, and you'll be able to find out that the smallest particle we can get roughly about 2 nanometers in diameters, and all the way to increase to about 4 to 5 nanometers right around the points of zero charge range. And so these are the solution phase processing. So that's a low temperature allow us to get the precursor that eventually lead to the highly structured intermetallic. Indeed, after pyrolysis of the temperature treatment, roughly about 400 to 600 degrees temperature range, and for about 1 hour, we'll be able to convert that into an intermetallic structure, as you can see from the signature XRD diffraction peaks, and the density, the internal particle size, and primarily reach about 3 nanometer also. So this is the idea that we try to promote the formation of intermetallic nanoparticles on the substrate at the ultrafine structures. So previously, the smallest one for the platinum cobalt reported about somewhere between 5 to 7 nanometers. We hope that we'll be able to push this further and see whether we can increase the density by changing the substrate further. One of the encouraging measurement for the fuel cell catalyst performance is the durability. And the last panel of this fuel cell test features give us some clue on that. And that is if you have the intermetallic structure, the durability maintained is quite well. And the activity after 10,000 cycles, and it's only dropped by 3.3%. And unfortunately, further testing longer cycle is this durability does not maintain as well as this. So we're still trying to figure out the exact reason for that. If you look at the non-intermetallic larger system, and it actually can drop by 30% under the same performing chart. Okay, so this is one thing that we're kind of interested to see whether we can continue to improve the performance, hopefully with high particle densities. Let me shift quickly to the second topic on the non-Pgm catalyst. Kind of lost track of the time, so if I over the time, just ask me to stop. So for the non-Pgm catalyst, this is primarily based on the metal, nitrogen, and carbon, and 3-element-based system by and large. The common consensus is that the single atom metal size around the nitrogen and carbon matrix give the highest activities. So this leads to a general strategy to improve the performance by reduce the metal formation through the pyrolysis processes using well-defined structures. One of the common strategy is to use a sacrificial metal-based so-called ZIF-8 metal organic framework. And so in this recent study, we try to increase the single atom densities by lower down the temperature using alternative sacrificial metals. So what this is, the background is that for typical MOF-derived non-PGM catalysts, i.e. for the metal center, it could be carbon, cobalt, or manganese. And what happened here is that through the pyrolysis, some of these active metals maintain, but the sacrificial metal, for example, this dark spots represent in this chart, should remove during the process. And typically, this dark metal is the zinc. So to test the concept, we identify one of the metals, i.e. the cadmium, has a lower boiling temperature, and we can see whether that can still maintain the carbon-nitrogen structure, but reduce the formation of nanoparticle by lowering down the temperature. So to do so, we identify several different types of precursor. This is one of the combinations. And the key development besides the metal part is the choice of a new type of the MOF precursor, i.e. the TPA and the debicals. Okay, so these are the molecular structures that can be enjoyed here. By using this bidental ligands, we were able to form the kind of MOF precursor with good crystallinities. And this allowed us to start to think about the fine dispersion of atomically separated structure by uniformly distributed along the molecular matrix. And to do so, then we also use the ammonia, the fresh pyrolysis developed at the 750 rather than the commonly used 950 for this study. So this is the result we obtained, and the XRD demonstrate no ion peak formations. And if you look at the carbon lastly converted carbon metal matrix, you don't see nanoparticle. You will see evenly distributed contrast, typically suggesting the metal dispersion are quite well in the system. We did a comparison with the typical ZIF-A derived OR catalyst. If you look at the polarization curves and the ion-based system for our system, you start to see the activation already. But for ZIF-8 at 750 degrees, you do not see the OR activity at all. So this is quite encouraging. But on further calculation and see what the metal center could be, and it still should contain, for example, the nitrogen species as well as the iron species, as being demonstrated in this EOS study. And on the surface, not necessarily surface, on the TEM image, you can see the single particles or single bright spots, and this is actually the single atom of iron in the system. And look at the iron-nitrogen structure. It is predominantly the iron-nitrogen-based systems in our study as being demonstrated in the Mossborough study. Lastly, the valence being also characterized, it should be somewhere between the 2+ and the 3+ for our system, but we do not know the exact composition of it. This is one of the challenges we're still facing to identify specifically how many nitrogen surrounding the iron in this particular case, whether there's a strain to cause that deviated from the normal iron-nitrogen flow structure. This is something we're still looking for in our study. And so to summarize the second part, and so the key points here is that by using a different ligand and using a different sacrificial metals, you'll be able to improve the the single atom dispersion quite well. The future study, of course, is to do the system level membrane electro calculations and look at both the initial part, and more importantly, perhaps, is also the power densities, performance, and what we can get out of this type of system. And the other areas that we probably need help is with understanding the mechanism. And this is related using the density function theory calculation to understand what happens if you have a higher level of single atoms. So with that, I think my time is up. I just want to emphasize that the development on the intermetallic is necessary, but the focus on our current study is moving more towards the catalyst development related to high density systems at the MEA level. So on that note, I want to thank my student and thank you for your kind invitation.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very beautiful works. So I found many collaboration chance with me. So I'm very excited. So I can accept unfortunately one short question. So is there any question from the audience? Raise your hand.
If not, can I have one question? So,
Yes.
Dr. Hong, thank you very much for very beautiful work. And you showed the good OER electrocatalysis with yttrium leucinate and also good ORL electrocatalysis for the intermetallic particles. So my question is, what about the opposite function? For example, yttrium leucinate can work as ORL catalyst or vice versa for the intermetallic. In other words, bifunctioning is possible.
I cannot definitely see that's possible, but I would say yes, it's very encouraging. If you can develop bio-based system, that's actually a lot of opportunities probably in there. I listened to previous talk and already have some idea, and it's probably better suited from the base system for several other applications rather than direct fuel cell for low, let's say, low temperature system for hydrogen fuel cell production in acid. Yeah. But on the base side, that should have a lot of opportunities.
Okay.
That's a very nice system. Yeah.
And also one suggestion that the similar work to your intermetallic electrocatalysis is done by Miho Yamauchi of another thrust. So I think you can talk with her about the collaboration, I think. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's time to stop the talk. So thank you very much, Professor Hong Yang. So yeah, so let me move to the next Stephan's talk. So Ishihara Sensei, please. Yeah.
Can you hear me? I would like to introduce the next speaker. Next speaker is the Professor Skinner from the Imperial College. And he's in fact my quite old, I know him quite old. He's young at that time. Anyway, his talk is on some steam effect on the ion conductivities. So Professor Skinner, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Ishihara. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me try and share my screen. And let me go to presentation mode. So hopefully you can all see my presentation and hear me well. As I say, it's a great pleasure to be here talking to you in the Energy Materials Symposium this week. And as Tatsumi said, I'd like to discuss a little bit of the work that we've been doing on investigating effects of humidity on ion transport in mixed conducting oxides. And this is some work that my current student, Jiji Xia, has been doing, following on from some work of Zhonghao Shen, who completed her PhD some years ago. So firstly, let me give you some background. So not all of you will be familiar with the solid oxide cells. So solid oxide cells, we're referring to a series of systems, so the solid oxide fuel cell, electrolyzer mode, but also in transport membranes, so based on essentially oxide ion conducting systems, which are therefore typically based on ceramic oxides. And in this case, the ion transport, in particular, we're looking at oxide ion transport, is introduced through the allyl-valent substitution on lattice sites. That creates those lattice vacancies, giving the oxygen mobility within those particular materials, and operating essentially at elevated temperatures. So we're looking at operation from temperatures greater than 500 degrees C up to around about 1000 degrees C. Those Transport properties are typically evaluated in well-controlled laboratory environments, and hence that gets to the crux of the matter as to why we're interested in the effects of humidity and how that reflects our previous understanding of these transport properties. The materials that we're interested in are typically the perovskite. We've just heard about perovskite type oxides. So the ABO3 type perovskite illustrated here with this octahedral B-site coordinated environment. And the other component, particularly of the transport membranes, is the fluorite type lattice, typically zirconias and cerias, for example. So what I want to focus on really is the work that we've been doing on oxygen transport membranes. And so this is essentially a device which is analogous to the solid oxide and solid oxide electrolysis cells, in which case they have two ceramic electrodes, so a fuel electrode and an air electrode. And for the oxygen transport technology, we have a gas separation layer, which is analogous to the electrolyte in the solid oxide fuel cell. The key difference really is that gas separation layer, the membrane layer, is typically a dual phase mixed conducting membrane. The other fundamental difference is that these are typically very high temperature of operation devices, so operating typically at 900 to 1000 degrees C. So our studies of these materials have effectively focused on this higher operating temperature regime. And this is essentially the device that we've been looking at. So this is an image courtesy of Praxair in the US, where again, we're looking at this oxygen reduction process on the air electrode, charge transfer reactions, and then ion migration through the separation membrane. And our focus really is on the effect of humidity on the reactions on this air electrode side of the device. So if we define the problem that we're trying to tackle is, as I mentioned briefly in the first couple of slides, that the transport measurements that we have typically undertaken are through well-controlled oxygen partial pressure isotopic exchange measurements under defined PO2s and typically defined dry PO2s. Now, clearly that's great for defining the kinetic parameters of your device, of your material, but those materials operate in devices under atmospheric conditions where you have significant pollutants, humidity, etc., which may, of course, influence those operating parameters. And so the device itself clearly is, its performance is related to some of those key kinetic parameters. So the oxygen diffusion through the material, but also those surface exchange reactions, including that oxygen reduction and charge transfer across the surface. So to tackle that problem, what we've looked at doing is using a controlled humid atmosphere, varying the partial pressures of oxygen and steam to probe that effect of humidity on those oxygen exchange and transport properties. Now, for those of you not familiar with the techniques, I'll very briefly go over that. So the idea is that we use an isotopic exchange technique where we anneal our ceramic samples in isotopically enriched gases. So for the dry exchanges, we're using isotopically enriched oxygen, so the oxygen 18 isotope. For the humid measurements, we're requiring the labeled water, so H218O. And for the mixed atmospheres, then we're mixing H218O with the dry oxygen gases, but also H2O with 18O2. So we have these mixed gas atmospheres. We then undertake our exchange anneal, analyze the results of those depth profiles in our secondary ion mass spectrometry instrument, using depth profiling and line scanning to probe directly the oxygen transport, fitting that data to fixed second law of diffusion. And so the process is essentially taking our ceramic, doing this exchange as isotopic anneal, and undertaking a cross section, so preparing the ceramic, polishing, making a nice section that we can analyze, creating a destructive depth profile from which we can then extract our exchange parameters, our diffusivity and our surface exchange coefficients. So the typical diffusion profile that you would extract from this type of measurement would be our normalized concentration of our isotope against our depth. And this is a nice diffusion profile from a standard ceramic. And from that, we can then also, in a separate experiment, determine the depth of the crater and correlate that to the sputtering depth. That allows us to extract our diffusion coefficients. It is destructive, but it is unambiguous in that it identifies the tracer species, but can also extract microstructural effects if you're fortunate with things like grain boundary diffusion. So let's turn to some of our initial data on the system. So the initial investigation was looking at our lanthanum, strontium, chromium iron oxide compositions. So these were slightly A-site deficient with different iron to chromium ratios. So these are the 30% chromium, 50% and 70% chromium compositions. And these were initially annealed in a pH2O of 120 millibars with no oxygen balance. From that, we can see we have some very nice diffusion profiles out to roughly 60 microns in depth. So we had effective gas exchange and effective diffusivity of the oxygen tracer in that scenario. From that, we then did some fitting. And rather surprisingly, what we found in this initial study was that for all three compositions, if we compared the diffusivity in a wet atmosphere with that obtained in the dry atmosphere, there was something approaching a 2 to 3 order of magnitude enhancement in the diffusion coefficient, whilst the surface exchange coefficients were staying roughly the same, not very much influence there at all. This was somewhat of a surprise, so we felt that it was a useful exercise to go back and revisit these samples and control the PO2 and pH2O in a more rigorous fashion, controlling both the oxygen partial pressure and the steam partial pressure. For that, we decided to focus on one composition, so the 50-50 composition. Extending that study, we were then looking at this 50-50 chrome iron composition in a PO2 environment where we had either 200 millibars of oxygen with 30 millibars of steam, or 200 millibars of oxygen with 0 millibar of steam, so the wet and the dry atmosphere. Annealing that at 900 degrees C, we can see that we get a very nice diffusion profile again. But what we can also observe in this case, in contrast to the previous study, is that the diffusion coefficients were virtually identical in both dry and wet conditions. Whereas in this case, the surface exchange was notably suppressed. So there's about 1 to 2 orders of magnitude difference in the surface exchange coefficient under that wet oxygen atmosphere. So we wanted to gain some further understanding of the surface structure and how that impacted on these exchange parameters. So we turned to X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy in both the dry and wet samples. So ex situ measurements on ideally treated samples. So we've focused on the strontium 3D and the oxygen 1s species. And we can see that in the dry atmosphere, we have these oxygen 1s species corresponding to the oxygen metal and some OH. In the wet atmosphere, we have an additional feature corresponding to water, and we can also see a difference between the surface and bulk strontium signals in that XPS. And this is looking at the angle resolved. So this is a very shallow takeoff angle. If we then compare that to the situation where we have the normal angle, so the penetrating XPS measurement, compared to the angle resolved, we can see clearly that there is a difference between what would be the bulk composition and the surface composition. So we can clearly see significant strontium segregation. And we can go further with that and quantitatively analyze those XPS data. If we do so, we can then determine the ratios of the constituents in this 8255 composition as a function of the depth. And if we focus on just the surface strontium to bulk strontium ratio, we can see clearly that as we go to higher temperatures, the ratios are significantly different between the normal measurements, so the penetrating, and the angle resolved measurement at the 80-degree tilt angle, so the shallow concentration, where we see significant surface strontium segregation. And notably, the cation species, the chromium species, are all staying into roughly as expected stoichiometries. So strontium segregation in these perovskites is perhaps not unexpected, and indeed that is confirmed by our secondary electron imaging. So we have our data from the SEI. I seem to have lost my cursor. So the SEI is clearly showing us that we have segregation of species predominantly at the grain boundary. And from further analyses, we can identify that that is indeed those strontium species preferentially segregating to those grain boundaries. But as well as doing the XPS and the SEI imaging, we also did some analyses of the gas atmosphere in the exchange. And in that case, we now see that there are some significant changes between the atmosphere at the start and at the end of the exchange, which is highlighting that there is indeed homo-exchange in the gas phase, and that that is potentially a further complication and limitation to the surface exchange coefficient. So now we have essentially two sets of data, so one at 120 millibar of steam, and one where we have the mixed atmospheres. So again, we wanted to go a little bit further and control that and compare directly the partial pressures of steam with the humid atmosphere and the dry atmosphere. So moving forward from there to probe how that moves along, and my computer, I'm afraid, is running remarkably slowly. There we go. So now we have some diffraction data of the three samples. So three samples, one of which is dry oxygen exchanged, one of which is wet, and one of which is under the pure water, so essentially a reducing condition. So interestingly, the observation is that all of those are stable after that 27 hours anneal, so the bulk composition is unaffected. But closer examination of the data by Rietveld analysis of high quality structural data, of particularly the reducing samples, so the pure water environment, highlights that there are in fact splittings of the main perovskite reflections. And the insets here highlight very nicely those splitting features, which indicates that there are two structurally related perovskites that are coexisting. And that only occurs after that anneal atmosphere. And further to that, we also observe from the backscatter imaging these contrast features in our micrographs. So turning to some stem analyses, we were interested in identifying what those species were. And so from the segregation, we looked at the cross section in the stem analyses, and this is a 500 nanometer scale bar. We can see a clear feature in this subsurface. And from that, and using some stem EDS, we can see that it's clearly lanthanum deficient, it's clearly iron rich, and slightly chromium enriched. So there is a segregation of a third phase, so an iron chrome phase, which may well be of the spinel type. So there are some significant differences in the anneal environments between the steam atmosphere and the wet atmosphere, the pure water. So if we compare the diffusion profiles of those two environments, so keeping the pH2O identical, so 30 millibars, but in this case introducing the oxygen to give us a wet oxygen environment, we can now see that this is a 0.22 hour time step, and we have this diffusion profile down to about 70 microns, implying a fast diffusion pathway. Whereas with the wet oxygen atmosphere, it was a 3-hour anneal, and we're only getting down to about 6 microns. So again, implying a significant difference in the diffusion kinetics in these two atmospheres. So if we move forward from there, and there's a few tables now, I'm afraid, so I'll point out some of the key features. So now we have the comparison between the pure water, so the reducing condition effectively, the dry oxygen and the wet oxygen, looking at the oxygen diffusion transport parameter, and we can clearly see that the dry and wet oxygen are of the same order of magnitude, 10 to the minus 12 at 900 degrees C, 10 to the minus 13 at 800. Whereas in the pure water, we've got about a 2 to 3 order of magnitude improvement in that diffusion coefficient. So again, this reaffirms the initial data that we had in that 120 millibar system. If we then look at the ratios of the surfaces, we can see there's a critical point between 800 degrees C and 900, where the surface to bulk strontium ratios change dramatically. But also we can see that that's an effect of time. So if we look at the duration of the exchange with the surface to bulk strontium signals, we can clearly see a dramatic difference between the 0.2 hours and the 3 hours in terms of that strontium segregation species. So some significant differences just on going to a slightly more reducing oxygen atmosphere, a wet atmosphere effectively. And to illustrate that over the full range of temperatures that we've analyzed, we have the 3 sets of data here. So the wet oxygen, the dry oxygen, and that pure water atmosphere. So the activation energies for both wet and dry oxygen, very similar. Overall diffusion parameters within error. The pure water, so that reducing condition, we have a slightly lower activation energy and that significant increase in the diffusion kinetics. Turning to the surface exchange parameter, on the other hand, the wet oxygen suppresses that surface exchange reaction in comparison to the dry oxygen environment, but the activation energies are dramatically different. Whereas in the pure water environment, the surface exchange is apparently significantly improved. And that's illustrated in the determined parameters in the table here. So is that an effect that is only seen in these lanthanum strontium chromates? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, the answer to that is no. And some work that was done almost in parallel with Vincent Thoroton and John Kilner, which I was not involved with, but Vincent and John were doing this in parallel on a different system, different temperature. So this is looking at the lanthanum strontium cobalt iron oxide system at a remarkably low temperature of 350 degrees C. So again, looking at the labeled exchange into the ceramic. And their observation is that the water again suppresses the surface exchange of the molecular oxygen, but the direct incorporation from the water molecule was greater than the dry oxygen species at these temperatures. So the effect of humidity on the surface exchange and diffusion parameters in these perovskites is really quite profound and quite significant, and therefore is certainly a parameter that we should be taking into account when we're considering the materials for application in devices. And this work of Vincent's has just been published. The DOI is there in PCCP. And I note that I'm getting towards the end of my time, so I'll finish off with my summary. So we've investigated diffusion and surface exchange behavior of our lanthanum chromate ceramics, probing the humidity on both the parameters a function of PO2 and pH2O. We can see significant strontium surface segregation, not necessarily surprising. We do get suppression of oxygen exchange at high temperature in humid atmosphere, enhancement of oxygen diffusion in the reducing pure water atmosphere, and that there is a dominant effect of the HOMO exchange in the gas phase, affecting those surface exchange parameters. And that effectively leads to the conclusion that there's a significant amount more work that is required to fully understand the exchange behavior in these mixed gas atmospheres in these perovskite phases. And with that, I will finish off by thanking those that did the work, so Gigi and Zhonghao, and for the microscopy and XPS, Eleonora and Willem, the EPSRC JSPS core-to-core program for the funding. This is the SOIFIT network, the rest of the research group, and of course yourselves for your attention. And as an editor of a journal, it would be remiss if I didn't finish by advertising the Journal of Materials Chemistry A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stephen. Quite nice talk. And then I recognize that water is a great influence on the diffusivity of the oxide ions in the mixed conductor. So now is the open for the question and comment. Is there any question and comment? From the audience, please open the mic and ask Professor Skinner on these presentations. Yes, please. Cynthia.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is probably a really dumb question, but I'm just sort of curious, when you have these environments where you've got this gas, then of course you're going to have electric fields at the surface, even if you're not imposing them, just because of ionizing species and contact potentials and the like. How big of a role are they playing in these kinetics? Because I could imagine those fields could be locally quite large.
it's an interesting point. It's not something we've measured. So I think it's certainly something that's worth bearing in mind. I don't have an idea of the magnitude. John, I don't know if you've investigated that in any of your work on the LSCFs.
No, we haven't. No.
So no, it's worth probing, but it's something that we need to think about measuring.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any question? No. I just ask you on the very short questions. You show that some phase separation is occurred. And then is this phase separation no influence on the diffusivity of the oxygens? Or that this phase separation is the origin of the improved oxygen diffusion in bulk?
That is a very good question, Tatsumi, and we don't, so that the phase separation, we seem to see that the secondary perovskite phase is very similar in composition. It's just a different polymorph, so it's probably due to oxygen stoichiometry. One thought is that the improvement is potentially partially due to greater numbers of vacancies in a reducing atmosphere, but there's no significant measurable difference. So we thought we could try attempting to measure that by using things like neutron diffraction to probe the actual oxygen content, but there's no measurable difference within the neutron diffraction. So there's no evidence that the phase separation is directly leading to an improvement in the diffusivities.
Okay,
but it's
thank
something
you.
that we need to follow up on.
Okay, thank you. So time is over. So thank you very much for your nice presentation today. And I'm looking forward to see you again in future. After
Likewise,
the
Natsumi, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your nice talk.
Thank you.
And then I pass to the next speaker, Kono Sensei.
Thank you very much, Ishihara Sensei. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evenings. My name is Masamichi Kono from Kyushu Universities, and I will chair the next presentation. I'd like to invite Professor Koji Takahashi. He is member of both I2CNER and Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Kyushu Universities. The title of his talk is Towards a Reliable Cooling Technology from Nanoscale Transport Phenomena. Professor Takahashi, please.
Okay, thank you for your kind introduction. My name is Takashi. These are my collaborators. Today, my talk is on cooling technology. Especially I'd like to explain why nanoscale phenomena are treated for cooling. Well, this is the outline of my talk. After a short introduction, I will talk about two kinds of cooling technology. One is device level and the other chip level. Energy is, of course, the main issue of I2CNER, and this slide shows the electricity demand for information and communication technology, ICT. ICT currently consumes about 10% of global electricity, but its demand will quickly increase to 21% in 2030. And the fraction of data center will continuously increase, and especially we have to be careful about the air conditioning. This is as much as 38% in the total energy in the data center. More efforts should be made to save energy about cooling technology towards a carbon neutral society. This slide shows the current cooling technology for data center, which ranges from large scale air conditioning to chip level heat spreader. The air conditioners and many fans consumes a lot of energy. And actually, Facebook data center was built in Sweden, but our tech strategy is different from them. We believe phase change heat transfer can solve this problem. Before talking about hotspot issue and low dimensional material, I'd like to explain phase change heat transfer first. This graph shows a typical trend, how much heat removal can be obtained by each heat transfer method. As you see, this two-phase system using liquid vapor phase change shows a very high heat flux. And actually, a heat pipe and a vapor chamber are frequently used for high power electric devices, but still they are far from their ideal performance. And as you see, in this movie, the high power heat removal mechanism is very complicated and multi-scale, and anyway, difficult to understand. In I2CNER, we are studying on the veiled phase change phenomena by using newest microscopies, AFM and TM. Both of them are of very excellent spatial resolution, 1 nanometer. And I believe it is a very unique approach, even in the world, to use both these newest microscopy for investigating the phase change phenomena. And now both of them are available to investigate the solid liquid interface like this. This slide shows AFM images obtained by our group, especially the very tiny and nanoscale gas phases. The biggest one is the nanobubbles at the liquid water graphite interface. And the next one is micro pancake and disordered and ordered gas layers. These 4 types of gas phases have been found. For example, this ordered gas layer consists of air molecules aligned epitaxially on the carbon atoms of the graphite surface. We firstly found this micro pancake can move, but are pinned at the edge of lower layers. This is a very important finding to understand the phase change phenomena. In this slide, I'm showing 2 movies of nanobubbles using TEM. Bubbles are generated and we can see their growth and coalescence. But these bubbles are hydrogen bubbles produced by radiolysis of water molecules induced by electron beam. But these movies allow us to understand what is different between nanoscale and macro scale bubbles. For example, in our newest publication, we propose a new mechanism of nanobubble coalescence. As you see, and also I showed here, these 2 bubbles are combined via this very thin gas layer. This is totally different from the macro scale coalescence of large bubbles, where liquid film break down between them. But in nanoscale, this kind of very thin gas layer is very important. Anyway, this kind of understanding of nanoscale two-phase phenomena is very important for phase change heat transfer. But let me go back to this introduction slide. I will talk about this low dimensional material for thermal management. Let's see what's happening on a chip in this half century. In BLSI, the size of a single transistor is becoming smaller and smaller, and the density of transistors keeps increasing. I'm so sorry, but anyway, this is a very difficult situation. Sometimes this kind of three-dimensional structure are applied, but anyway, such dense transistor becomes a hotspot as high as 10 kilowatt per square centimeters. This is higher than the sun surface. So anyway, we have to dissipate this heat flux from this very tiny space. These cooling challenges have hindered the development of chips, CPU, as pointed out in this Nature perspective. The Moore's law for the semiconductor industry has already started to fail. And important reason is a cooling bottleneck. One solution is to apply novel two-dimensional materials in chips. These nanomaterials have atomic size and superior electrical and thermal properties. But time is limited. I will skip the detail about the application of these new two-dimensional materials. But remember, the thermal property of low-dimensional materials is totally different from bulk material. And accurate some physical property measurement is very important, but very challenging. Let me briefly explain how heat is dissipated in this kind of two-dimensional system. Here, Joule heat is generated here and dissipated through two passes. The first one is in-plane conduction. The Joule heat dissipate in the two-dimensional material itself. And the other one is a cross-plane conduction, which is shown by this number 2. Both should be considered, but at first, I'd like to talk about the in-plane conduction. In this case, we have to remove the effect of this number 2 conduction. That is, we can remove such effect by isolating the 2D material from the substrate. This is an example showing how to measure the in-plane heat conduction. By using the MEMS technique, we successfully isolate the graphene nanoribbon like this. And we could measure the thermal conductivity. Its size, and especially the width, is 170 nanometer, almost half of phonon mean free path of the large area graphene. And we obtained the thermal conductivity of such a suspended graphene nanoribbon. This is our data. The thermal conductivity of suspended graphene nanoribbon shows 350 watt per meter Kelvin at room temperature. This is only 1/5 of large area graphene mainly due to the phonon edge scattering. And recently, we have fabricated a new suspended graphene nanoribbon, which are much thinner and smaller than the previous one using a new fabrication process. This process ensures a very smooth ribbon edges and also high quality or low defect in the graphene sample. And we measured the thermal conductivity and Seismic coefficient and also electrical conductivity to evaluate the ZT, the some electric performance. And because of course the thermal conductivity is also reduced and Seismic coefficient is enhanced very much as 6 times from the bulk silicon single layer graphene. This is due to the opening of the band gap of graphene. Combining the reduced thermal conductivity and enhanced Seismic coefficient, we achieved the record high ZT 0.1. This is a record for the graphene sample, which this kind of data, this kind of result can be useful in another direction towards carbon neutral society. The previous slides treat only in-plane conduction, but here let me explain how to evaluate the cross-plane conduction. This number 2 heat. Raman spectroscopy can be used to detect temperature of both 2D material and substrate. I mean, temperature here, temperature of this material, and also the temperature of substrate. Then we can evaluate, and we can measure the interfacial thermal conductance G just between the 2-dimensional material and substrate. Interfacial thermal conductance G, because the Raman signal can be obtained simultaneously from the different material. This Raman shift is from substrate. This one is from 2D material, graphene and so on. Then we can, and also this Raman shift is dependent on the temperature, which means from these 2 signals, we can obtain the 2 temperatures here and here simultaneously. So we can obtain the interfacial thermal conductance. This is a very excellent measurement method. And based on this principle, we developed the so-called transient Raman method to measure both suspended and supported 2D material. Yeah, previously I explained the suspended material, suspended graphene only, but for the practical application, supported material is more important. By using our transient Raman method, we obtained the thermal conductivity of supported graphene. The data is 850 watt per meter Kelvin. This is less than half of the large area single layer graphene due to the effect of the substrate. Substrate limit the vibration of the graphene atoms. And also we obtained the interfacial thermal conductance G which ranges in 0.1 to 10 megawatt. This kind of interfacial value is very difficult to obtain, but this data is important. So now we can design the thermal issues in the chip consisted of this kind of a 2D material. So such measurement technique is very important. Not only the reliability of CPU, but also for the reduction of the electricity of cooling. Okay, let me summarize my talk. Phase change is powerful and zero energy cooling method, and our nanoscale research should improve its reliability. And the two-dimensional material is promising as heat spread, and our thermal property measurement gives correct data. Okay, thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahashi. So now the presentation is open for discussions. Any question or comment?
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Koji, for your nice presentation. I have a simple question about the nanobubbles.
Okay.
So how high is the pressure inside the nanobubbles? Maybe I asked this question before, but I forgot the answer, because the nanobubble is very small. Therefore, the Laplace pressure calculated by the curvature becomes very high. But I cannot believe such a high pressure inside the bubbles.
Okay. Okay. In the nanoscale, the situation is totally different. So as I described here, the gas molecules or nitrogen, oxygen, air molecules are coming very close to the substrate. So the situation is totally different from the bulk water. So, and also pinning maintain the flatness of the nanobubble. These nanobubbles are much flatter than the normal large bubbles. So Laplace pressure decreases, and also the supersaturation is a very extreme situation at this interface. So this kind of bubbles becomes stable. This is my answer.
Okay. So next question is, when this bubble start to grow, so did you observe the bubble growth?
Yeah.
What is the condition?
Oh, okay. Yeah, we observed sometimes of such a growth, but still we don't have the good answer. Yeah, still such a dynamic phenomena is difficult to catch and understand. So thank you for your question, but maybe next time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kono-sensei.
Okay. Okay, so Professor Fujikawa, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your nice talk. Actually, my question is related to the Takata sensei. So could you show us a 10 picture of the nanobubble? Maybe slide 8 or 9. I guess 9. I'm just simply curious about the fusion of the nanobubble. Usually at the bulk phase, once bubble is attached, quickly merge. But according to your TEM image, it takes a longer time.
Yeah.
Looks like.
Yeah.
Why such kind of situation happen in a nanometer scale?
Oh, yes, good question. Probably in this case, this is a hydrogen bubble and induced by the electron beam. And there are so many ion, OH minus and so on. So probably this interface, there are so many ions and they show repulsive forces, so that this liquid film is very stable.
Okay. Okay.
So a little bit different situation from the bulk state.
Okay. Oh, all right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anyway, this liquid film is very stable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any questions? So if no, since the time is running out, so I'd like to move the next presentation. Professor Takahashi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so hello. So maybe the next presentation is from our thrust. I would like to shortly introduce our thrust. Maybe you can see my screen. Okay, so our thrust is the multi-scale science and engineering for energy and environment. So we sometimes call our thrust as a MSEEE. And our thrust is composed of the 4 topics. The first one is the carbon capture technology based on the membrane separations. And the second one is the carbon CO2 storage. And the third one is the energy efficient technologies. And fourth one is the social, techno, economic, and policy analysis. And here I showed the picture and name of PIs. And today from our thrust, we mainly talk about the CO2 negative emission technologies and the carbon neutral technologies. And the first speaker is the Roman, and the second one is from me, and the third one is the Andrew. And we summarize these workshops. Okay, so I think the time is maybe 30 minutes behind. So we move to the presentations. So today the Professor Ikeda will work as a chair. So Professor Ikeda, can you work as a chair?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tsuji, for introducing our division. I'm Tatsunori Ikeda, belonging to Kyushu University. Okay, let's move on to the first speaker. First speaker is Professor Roman Selianchin. Are you ready? Okay.
Yes, I guess I'm ready.
Okay, so the title of his presentation is Membrane-Based Direct Air Capture for Fuel Production and Negative Emissions. So please start.
Yeah, thank you very much for introduction, Professor Ikeda. Hello, everybody. My name is Roman Selianchin, and it is a great honor to be among presenters in this workshop. And as you see, the title of my presentation is quite broad, but I will focus mainly on the membrane-based CO2 capture part and how it fits into larger idea of carbon recycling society. So here is the outline of my presentation. And first, I would like to talk a little about the current emissions of carbon dioxide in Japan, and then about the future vision of Japanese government of the carbon net zero society pledged to be achieved by 2050. And as you will see, the Japanese government relies strongly on the industrial carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies instead of just phasing out fossil fuels. And then I will explain why we recently expanded our research efforts from industrial CO2 capture to direct air capture. And finally, I will talk about our research related to the gas separation membranes for this purpose. And the reason we are doing the research related to carbon dioxide capture is, of course, trying to contribute somehow into solutions for climate change. And everybody here is familiar with the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and resulting warming. But climate change is not only warming, it has a lot of features. And when I talk about climate change in Japan, I sometimes talk about this. And here one can see the beautiful Japanese cherry blossoms in Kyoto, end of March 2018, and the date is very important here. So in my presentation, I often show this infographic, which is very relevant to this country, and the graph shows the timing of peak bloom of Japanese cherry blossoms in Kyoto, Japan. And it turns out that data was collected for more than 1,000 years by ancient monks and currently by scientists. And what we can see here is a clear trend of the recent 100 to 200 years, which shows that the event of the cherry blossoms blooming in Kyoto happens sooner and sooner with every year. Also, cherry blossom is reflecting more of a local climate, but it is a good proxy indicator of the warming and is clearly observed from the middle of 20th century, quite long ago. And here you can see the point from 2018 from the previous photo. So you see sakura blooming happened very, very quickly just 2 years ago. And we know that emissions of greenhouse gases are the main reason of climate change. And Japan is among largest CO2 emitters. And emissions were quite stable for almost last 30 years, as you can see here. And according to the Paris Agreement, the country was aiming emission reductions by 26% by 2030 in the nearest 10 years, and then by 80% by 2050. But recently, the reduction target was increased, and now Japan works to achieve net zero by 2050 along with other developed countries. And the reliance on fossil fuels is, however, quite high, as you can see. And currently only about 10% in Japan are renewable energy in the energy mix. And therefore, there is a need of more aggressive renewable energy deployment. And also Japan, as you know, bets strongly on hydrogen as a main energy carrier. And what is interesting, Japan even considered banning the gasoline vehicles from 2030, but even in 2050, it does not declare that it will ban hybrid vehicles. But they are still using the fossil fuels, which suggests a huge agenda for CO2 capture, utilization, and storage as an additional remedy against the greenhouse gas emissions. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry posted this elaborate document outlining the future of energy system in 2050, which is shown schematically here. Actually, it took me 1 day to translate from Japanese to English. I hope you will get some idea. And it is quite complex picture, but it is important to see there are 4 main streams in this system, satisfying this energy system. And blue color is a stream for hydrogen, orange color is stream for electricity, green color is stream for carbon dioxide. And there is still gray color, which indicates the continued use of fossil fuels, for example. And as we see, the government does not reject completely the use of fossil fuels, and not only for the unavoidable industrial areas, but even for power generation. For example, we can find gas-fired or coal-fired power plant in this picture, which is really different from other countries. And continued utilization of fossil carbon and the net zero pledge at the same time puts very big burden on massive deployment of CO2 management infrastructure, right? And indeed, as I highlighted here, with the same picture, we can find different technologies aimed to control carbon emissions, namely conventional CCS, for example, here for hydrogen production, bioenergy and CCS, which is one of the negative emission technologies, as well as direct air capture with CCS. Also, there are plans to promote carbon capture via afforestation, for example, or in ocean. And in addition to CO2 sequestration, there is a large program for CO2 utilization. And this includes production of biofuels, synthetic fuels, utilization in concrete, for example, and even for production of plastics. So they mentioned, so the plastics will be made from CO2. And talking about the automobiles, which I already mentioned, what differs Japan from other countries, here we can find even the place for the conventional cars fueled with synthetic fuels, which means that the planned scale for CO2 utilization is indeed huge, especially for fuel production. And talking about the technologies for the industrial CO2 capture, we can name three that are most established in the post-combustion settings. And the main mature technology is well-known capture in liquid amines, which is shown here. It is very well established and already widely utilized on large scale. But according to even the most optimistic estimates, the capture cost cannot be lower than $40 per ton of CO2 captured, which is still strongly depends on the feed stream of the system. And two other methods that are used in CO2 capture are solid adsorbents, which is shown schematically here, and membrane-based separation. And these are still not widely used, only in pilot scale demonstration. But according to the process simulation papers, they have a potential to significantly reduce the cost of CO2 capture, especially for post-combustion application, for example, as you can see here for membrane-based separation. And in our group, we studied gas separation membranes for almost 6-7 years now. And initially, we worked to develop membranes for conventional post-combustion separation. And two critical parameters for efficient membrane separation are the CO2 permeance, which is simply the speed, how quickly gas passes through the membrane, and CO2 nitrogen selectivity, which shows how much quickly CO2 goes in respect to nitrogen, right? And the red point on this plot at the time indicates the benchmark membrane, which was called Polaris by Membrane Technology and Research, a very big membrane company in the United States. And this pink point at that time was our institute goal, which was set almost 7 years ago. And the main problem at that time was how to achieve these high permeances which are required for optimal membrane properties, right? You see this gray area is optimal membrane properties, and there is not much literature data. And we wanted to achieve the membranes in this area in order to satisfy the requirement for low-cost CO2 capture. And if you see, if we would develop this membrane, it would provide us about $15 per ton of CO2 captured. And actually, in order to increase the permeances, the common approach for these application-ready membranes would include the formation of at least 3-layer composite membranes, schematically shown on this picture, which consists of at least 3 well-tailored layers, selective gutter and microporous support. And and this structure allows, because the selective layer, which is the main selective barrier for gas separation, is deposited on much thicker gutter layer, does not require to rely on its mechanical properties. And as a result, there is no limitation in thinning. So that is why we are working on the thinning of the membranes and in particular selective layers. And why thinning is an interesting approach. So as we saw, and necessary approach, as we saw from the cost perspective, we critically need to increase how quickly gas passes the membranes. We critically need to increase the permeances of the CO2 in the membranes. And taking the inspiration from the nature, which has already constructed the ideal and very selective and very quick membranes, namely cell membranes as shown here, we investigate the membranes with extremely small thicknesses, moving from conventional thicknesses around 1 micron and sub-micron to sub 100 nanometer range. And by thinning, we aim to step up into the area in which the properties of the membrane will be changed, and diffusion as a main rate limiting factor of gas transport through the membrane is diminished. And the properties may be governed by the some surface phenomena on which we can rely. And of course, we don't have to forget that membranes, additional to the high permeance, should be defect-free and very highly selective. And recently we have demonstrated that the thinning can indeed lead to the breakthroughs in the membrane performance. For example, by taking one of the most, sorry, the light in my room just gone off. So for example, by taking one of the most widely used material in membrane science, which is polydimethylsiloxane, we were able to fabricate freestanding and defect-free membranes, which are shown in this photo, you can see, with a thickness of much below than 100 nanometers. And at this range, the permeances as high as 40,000 GPU were achieved, which is 20 to 40 times higher than the benchmark membranes, which are in this region, 1000 to 2000 GPU. And stable CO2 selectivity, which is shown here, so even down to the range of 40 nanometer thickness or 30 nanometer thickness, is another proof of the absence of any defects in the membrane. Otherwise, it would not show the selectivity. Moreover, the mechanical bending test of this membrane, already in composite state, was conducted, and the membrane didn't lose its properties. So it's even at nanoscale thickness, it's mechanically robust when stands on porous support. And in another major work, we have investigated the thinning of this selective layer, which I already mentioned, in the structure of the thin film composite membrane for the CO2 and nitrogen separation. And here you can see TEM image of this 3-layer membrane. So porous support, of course, it's very thick, but it's only top of the porous support is seen here. Gutter layer is around 400 nanometers, and the selective layer just few nanometers, from 2 to 20 nanometers. We were testing the thicknesses. And in addition to thinning, we have also changed the activity of the interface formed between 2 layers, which is manifested by the surface properties. For example, here, as you can see on this water contact angle measurement on the 2 different sides of the membrane. And we have elucidated that this ultra-thin selective layer composed of the selective layer copolymer is intermixed with the plasma-treated polydimethylsiloxane and forms the selective layer with selective barrier with very remarkable gas separation properties, as shown in this final image, where these red points indicate our work. And as you can see, they all feed into these optimal membrane properties for post-combustion CO2 capture. And from this study, we see that molecular design of the surface is very important to provide the necessary selectivity in the gas separation membrane, specifically for CO2 capture and separation. So all these works in previous years inspired us to consider the use of membranes for direct air capture, or at least pre-concentration from the ambient air. And gas separation with membranes actually has a big advantage compared to other technologies, because it is not limited in size. It can be made very compact or very big, and this does not necessarily means the change in cost of the capture or complexity of the project. And realizing the fact that it is technically very difficult to go from air concentration to 100% pure CO2, so we cannot just pre-concentrate ideally. We understand that it is very convenient to do on-site transformation of the pre-concentrated streams. And all these considerations became the foundation of the large research project recently approved by government, in which a big group of collaborating institutions and coordinated by I2CNER, particularly by Professor Fujikawa, this big group of collaborating institutions aims to create real compact systems suitable for distributed and ubiquitous CO2 capture and transformation to the fuel in order to satisfy this carbon recycling approach. And just to give you an idea of what the membrane system is expected to be, we recently conducted the process simulation study using the well-established environment based on Aspen Plus and membrane unit operation programmed by University of Lorraine in France. And what we found that for necessary level of preconcentration, one will need at least 3 stages of membrane separation and membrane with specific properties. And on this plot, you can see the dependence of the concentration in the product of each stage, because we have 3 stages, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, how the concentration of gas changes when it passes through the membrane. As you can see, it's only 1% when it passes one stage of membrane, which is obviously not enough for any type of chemical transformation. But after 3 stages, the concentration becomes relevant, and after communication with electrochemistry people, we understood that this would be sufficient concentrated feed in order to use this stream for chemical transformation of the carbon dioxide. Also, we have estimated the energy required for the CO2 capture, or CO2 preconcentration, if you will, And what we can see that depending on the selectivity, we can change this energy in a very broad range. So this green line actually indicates the total energy of the capture. As you can see, it's very close to the stage 1. It means stage 1, which works with the highest amount of gas, is of course the most energy consuming. And the total energy can be as low as 10 kilowatt per hours for kilogram of CO2 captured in this setting. And also because it is very important to estimate how big should be the membrane for the separation. Here we can see the dependence of the required area for kilogram capture per day, depending on the selectivity. As you can see, with the permeances which were used for calculation, which are not our highest, but our reliable permeances at which we can work. So you need just 5 to 6 to 7 square meters of total membrane area in order to operate the system. So these are all process simulation results which we have to prove experimentally. And with this, I would like to summarize my talk and to show that we have designed this MDAC system, membrane-based direct air capture system, and energy required is around 10 kilowatt per hour per kilogram of CO2. And considering that the energy which will power this system will come from the renewable sources, for example, solar PV electricity, we can say that this system can provide a carbon negative process, and at least 0.6 kilograms of CO2 can be captured. And the membrane areas are in practical range, around 10 square meters per whole 3-stage system. And the CO2 permeances which are required are at least 10,000 GPU, which we already have in our membranes. And the selectivities to other gases are also larger than 40, which we also designed with our surface modification techniques. And hopefully next time when Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry updates their picture of future, they will incorporate our systems at least schematically in 2050, and I hope the name of I2CNER will be also printed in that page. And yeah, with this I would like to acknowledge professors which I'm working with, researchers who supported and did these experiments, and of course funders who support and believe in our work. And thank you all for your kind attention. And I am a little bit too long, but hopefully if anybody has questions, we'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. So now it's time for discussion. If you have any questions or comment, please raise your hand or turn on your microphone.
I see Professor Sa.
Yes, sir, Dr. Roman, very nice presentation, and we are really excited to know all this achievement. I have some simple query. So how thin you can go with your membrane, like nanomembrane? What will be the critical thickness?
Yeah, so the lowest thickness we have achieved for the real working membrane was 34 nanometers. So the one which was stable for 1 year at least. So, but we realized that it is too thin. We want to have them so thin, but probably we will be in the range of 100 nanometers for the total 3-layer structure or 2-layer structure on porous support. Yeah, so at the moment, 35 nanometers is our limit. Well, the thinnest we worked with.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, is there any other questions or comments?
Roman, may I ask a question?
Oh, Professor Sofronis, of course, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this lucid outline of our moonshot. This is really very encouraging, very promising. Question is more on the techno-economics. I see here that we have 1 kilogram of CO2 per day. As you know, in I2CNER, we are trying to reduce the CO2 emissions. We have certain metrics there. how important this number is, the 1 kilogram of CO2 per day, if we consider, for instance, that we want to go to carbon neutrality?
Well, you know, these numbers are presented in order to understand how much it will take for 1 kilogram per day capture. But this system is not limited. What we are designing in Moonshot is a home-based system, residential, which will capture 2 kilograms. And we calculated 2 kilograms from the approximately the amount of gas, natural gas, which we are now using at homes. So in order to offset that, when we will start using CO2 as a putting it back. So, and this number only to give you an impression how much power it will take for 1 kilogram, but you can scale up, of course. In home, it will be few kilograms per day, maybe 4 to 5 kilograms. In company, it may be, in school, for example, it may be 1 ton per day. So that's not, that's like system is actually scalable.
Okay, good to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, so it's time to move on to the next presentation. So, Professor Roman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next presenter is Professor Tsuji. His title of presentation is Use Earth Toward Negative Emissions. So please start.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you see my slide? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Hi. My name is Takeshi Tsuji again. So our group try to use the Earth for the CO2 negative emission. Okay. So in more detail, we are studying the carbon capture and storage and geothermal energy. But when we focus on the CO2 negative emissions, we mainly we use the carbon capture and storage. So maybe as you know, the CCS or carbon capture storage, we inject the CO2 into the subsurface reservoir, and we try to reduce the CO2 emission into the atmosphere. And if we can capture the CO2 from atmosphere using the DAC system, direct air capture, and inject the CO2 into the geological formations, we can achieve the negative emission. So I believe this project is the CO2 storage is one of the main technologies to achieve the negative emission. And this project is a near-term impact, lower cost, and huge potential. So we can inject the large amount of CO2 into the geological formations. So CCS seems to be very good. and actually the IEA 2-degree scenario, the CCS provide the 14% of cumulative CO2 emission reduction. It's a very huge amount we can store. But we should seriously consider that if we achieve the CO2 reductions of this amount, we need to conduct about 6,000 large-scale CCS projects in the world. The large-scale CCS project means 1 million tons of CO2 injection every year. So if maybe around Japanese island, there are many CO2 injection sites like this. These red stars indicate the CO2 injection site. It's a not accurate point, but it's just my my brain, just a schematic image. Okay. So we need to manage the many reservoirs distributed in the wide area, and especially we need to accurately monitor the stored CO2 storage, CO2 of wide area. So recently we tried to develop an effective and low-cost monitoring system. So monitoring of the CO2 in the CO2 storage is very important because it's related to the risk evaluations and cost reduction and public understanding. So in my experience, the monitoring is one of the most important technology, and it is closely related to the public understanding. So we would like to develop an effective monitoring system. So the monitoring in the CO2 storage or oil gas production, it's a common approach is a time-lapse seismic survey. So this approach is very simple. We acquire the seismic data before the CO2 injection and after the CO2 injection. And by compare these two seismic data, we can extract the injected CO2 distribution. This is a very beautiful example in the Sleipner CCS project. It's a seismic data or geological structure before the CO2 injection. And this is the after. So here we can see the injected CO2 distributions. So this technique is mature, but it's a high cost. And we cannot acquire this data often, okay? So it is the long-term interval for the monitoring data acquisitions. So it is difficult to identify the rapid or accidental CO2 leakage. So recently we have developed the continuous monitoring system using ambient noise and continuous controlled seismic source system. And we try to achieve the low cost and continuous monitoring. So first part is I already showed maybe in the last year. So firstly, I talk about the ambient noise monitoring. So this is a picture of Japanese island, and these white dots are the seismometer. So these seismometer continuously record the seismic signal, right? So there are many geophysical data, and we try to use the ambient noise recorded by many seismometers for geophysical monitoring. Ambient noise is a very small vibration. So my house is vibrating, but we cannot feel because the energy is very small, but it's vibrating. And seismometer record such small vibrations. So we use such a ambient noise for the geophysical monitoring. So I don't speak the detail, but we can obtain this kind of monitoring result. So this is the continuous spatial and temporal seismic velocity variations of Japanese island. And this information is the 5-kilometer depth. It's a very deep, right? And the red area is the velocity increasing, seismic velocity seismic velocity decreasing. It means the material softening. And blue area is the seismic velocity increasing or material hardening occur there, okay? So when the earthquake occur, the central Kyushu area become red. It's a Kumamoto earthquake. And it's because due to the vibration, it's damaged, okay? And after the Mount Aso eruptions, the seismic velocity increase because of the depressurization due to the eruption, okay? So we can monitor the Japanese island using our monitoring system. So how to use this information for the CCS project? It's the next question, okay? So we may be able to use this monitoring data to distinguish the natural earthquake and CO2 injection-induced seismicity or CO2 injection-induced earthquake. So in Japan, there are many earthquakes and even around the CO2 storage site. For example, the Chuetsu earthquake occurred in 2004 close to the Nagaoka CCS project. And Hokkaido Iburi Tohobu earthquake occurred close to the Tomakomai CCS project. So some people worry about the relationship between the CCS and natural earthquake. So to obtain the public understanding, we should distinguish between the natural earthquake and CO2 injection-induced earthquake. And of course, we should prevent the CO2 injection-induced earthquake, okay? So we try to develop a method to distinguish the natural and artificial earthquake. So how to do? So we focus on the pore pressure. Pore pressure is the fluid pressure in the rock or in the earth, okay? So I don't speak the detail because of the limited presentation time, but we developed a method to estimate the pore pressure from seismic velocity monitoring. So from this information, we can estimate the pore pressure variations. And this pore pressure is closely related to the earthquake generations. So simply speaking, if pore pressure increase, the earthquake occur. It's not like a scientist word, but simply speaking, the pore pressure increase, the earthquake is easy to occur. So pore pressure monitoring is very important. And pore pressure monitoring can be achieved from this, the kind of the ambient noise monitoring. So how to use the pore pressure? Okay, next question. How to distinguish between the natural earthquake or the CO2 injection induced earthquake using natural pore pressure variations? Okay, so we can measure the natural pore pressure variations due to the weathering and remote earthquake from seismic velocity monitoring, as I showed you in the previous slide. Okay, so we can roughly estimate the pore pressure variations, natural pore pressure variations. And on the other hand, we can calculate the artificial pore pressure variations due to the CO2 injection using numerical simulations. Okay, and we compare these two pore pressure, natural pore pressure variation and artificial pore pressure variations. And if the natural pore pressure variation is much larger than artificial pore pressure variations, the earthquake could be natural one, not artificial earthquake. Okay, so it's a very simple. So we evaluate the Chuetsu earthquake close to the Nagaoka CO2 storage site using this evaluation method. So please look at this figure. The vertical axis is a pore pressure change, and the horizontal axis is distance from CO2 injection well. Okay, and black line indicate the black line is the pore pressure variation due to the remote earthquake. Okay, it's a kind of natural pore pressure variations. And this red area is the pore pressure variation due to the rain and snow melting. Okay, so pore pressure is naturally natural pore pressure is temporarily varied like this amount. And this blue line indicate the artificial pore pressure variation due to the CO2 injection. Okay, of course, the close to the CO2 injection well, the pore pressure variation is very high. But from these relationships, the natural pore pressure variation is much larger than artificial pore pressure variation at 1 kilometer far from the CO2 injection site. So this area, the natural pore pressure fluctuation is much larger than artificial pore pressure. And epicenter of the Chuetsu earthquake was about 20 kilometers from the injection site. So it's much far from injection site. So it means the earthquake seismogenic fault, the natural pore pressure variation is much larger than artificial pore pressure. So we can conclude the Chuetsu earthquake could be natural one. So like this, we can provide a scientific-based approach to classify the natural earthquake and artificial earthquakes. So recently we opened our monitoring system for the public people, and we develop an automatic processing system. So can we apply this ambient noise technique for the small scale reservoir of the CO2 storage? So actually, it's a bit difficult. For the monitoring of small scale reservoir, we should use the higher frequency signal, short wavelength signal. Okay, but such ambient noise is very unstable. So to accurately monitor the small scale reservoir, the seismic source should be more stable, especially for high frequency signal. So recently we have developed a continuous monitoring source system like this, and I reported this system in the last I2CNER workshop or symposium. And in this system, we rotate the eccentric mass. It's not so big, but we continuously rotate and generate the vibrations. And by stacking the long-term monitoring system, we try to improve the signal-to-noise ratios. So maybe I do not have a time, so I do not explain in detail. And we deploy our system in the geothermal field, Kuju geothermal field, if Fukuoka Kyushu University is around here. And we evaluate the monitoring source signal propagations using seismometer distributed around the monitoring source system. Monitoring source location is here. This is a picture. And the black dot are the locations of seismometer. So this is a result. The horizontal axis is travel time from source generation to receiver, okay? And vertical axis is distance. So amazingly, the signal, small vibration, very low energy vibration signal can propagate about 80 kilometers. It's very far from the monitoring system. We can detect the monitoring signal. So from this result, that we can monitor the wide area. It means the multi-CO2 storage site using our monitoring system. And I don't speak the detail, but we can observe the temporal velocity variation monitoring data in very high accuracy. We succeeded to estimate the seismic velocity variations in accuracy of about the 0.01%. It's a very high accurate, very high accurate the monitoring system. I don't speak the detail, but yeah, we succeeded to monitor the velocity variation in high accuracy. Okay, so we have one more problem. Okay, so the seismometer is very expensive. Seismometer, the receiver. So recently we use the distributed acoustic sensing, DAS system. So this is a very new system in seismology. Okay, so using this system, we can use the fiber optic cable as a seismometer, and the cable become a seismometer. It's easy to deploy on the seafloor. Okay, so we use this new technology. So I don't speak the details, sorry, because of limited presentation time. And we deploy this fiber optic cable and DAS system about the 1.7 kilometer far from our monitoring system. And we try to monitor the geothermal reservoir using the source system and DAS type seismometer. So we can clearly observe the signal propagate from the seismic monitoring source system. Okay, we observe the clear signal. Horizontal axis is travel time from source to receiver. Okay, so we can monitor the geothermal reservoir using this system. So using the continuous seismic source system and DAS type seismometer, we can achieve the low cost and continuous monitoring system. So this is my final slide. So this is an introductory slide. So as I talked, to achieve the large amount of CO2 reduction using CO2 storage, we needed to drill many boreholes for the CO2 injections. And we needed to monitor the wide area, okay? So we deployed the fiber optic cable seismometer. It means a very long and dense seismometer. And by using the continuous seismic source system, we continuously generate the monitoring signal. And we try to continuously monitor the many CO2 injection sites with low cost. And we try to manage the reservoir and the earth. And we try to achieve the large amount of CO2 reduction. And especially we try to achieve the negative emission. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. So it's time for discussion. Do you have any questions or comments?
Jesse,
Hi.
my question is, how sensitive is this new method to the depth of the stored CO2?
Yeah, it's related to the locations of the seismic source and receivers. And if of course, it's very easy to monitor the 1 kilometer reservoir. So yeah, so for the depth sensitivity, I don't worry about the depth sensitivity. Yeah, but my main concern, honestly speaking, my main concern is the spatial resolutions of monitoring. High temporal resolution, but a spatial resolution is maybe lower than the conventional method. So we try to solve that by developing the many source system. We optimize the monitoring system.
Okay, thank you.
Takeshi, may I ask you one question? So you showed the idea of pore pressure. It is the pressure of CO2 inside the pore?
Yeah, pore pressure is a bit more broad word. And if there's no CO2 there, the pore pressure is the water pressure of water. But
so so in the graph you showed, I saw the pressure is lower than the atmospheric pressure. What does this mean? So 10 to the 5th Pascal is the atmospheric pressure in my understanding.
This is a variation.
Difference.
Yeah, difference.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. So in the subsurface, the such temporal variations occur.
I understand. Thank you. So can you predict the new earthquake by monitoring the pore pressure?
Yeah, so maybe we can provide this information. And aftershock, it's easy. Aftershock, I mean so this is a Kumamoto earthquake occur like this, and it's become red. The red area is, honestly speaking, it's a higher pore pressure occur there. So around there, the many aftershock occur. So we can roughly estimate, and we can estimate the volcanic eruption. It's easier than earthquake.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Fujikawa-sensei.
Jesse, may I ask you, can you quickly help understand how the pressure modifies the modulus? I'm assuming something must be happening to the modulus of elasticity there, right, of the ground, the earth, that changes your dilatation wave speed. Can you quickly, in one line, in one sentence, tell us what is the underlying principle here between the relationship of the pressure and the modulus?
Seismic velocity or modulus is related to the effective stress. Okay, effective stress. And total stress equal effective stress plus pore pressure.
I see.
Effective stress and plus pore pressure is total pressure. Or in other words, effective stress is how can I say that? We need to subtract the pore pressure from total pressure. So it's very simple.
Yes.
And seismic velocity or modulus is related to the effective stress.
Yes.
So if we assume the total stress is constant, we can estimate pore pressure.
That's a good idea. Is that your group's idea that this is something that is out there in the open literature?
It's honestly speaking, my PhD thesis is the pore pressure estimation, this method.
I see. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. If there is no more question, we move on to the next presentation. So thank you very much for your presentation. So next presentation is the final presentation of this symposium. next presenter is Professor Andrew Chapman.
All right. Let me just check that everyone can see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and for everyone who stayed on the line, especially in Japan. It's already past 2 a.m., so let's battle on, and I will try to summarize. My presentation doesn't aim to be super scientific, but to just bring together all of the thoughts from today and hopefully give us a bit of a position on where we are and what we're doing. So mine is called Systematic Considerations for a Sustainable Carbon Neutral Energy System, which I think really is I2CNER's mission in a nutshell. Basic outline, introduction, systems thinking, some of our efforts within energy analysis that are relevant to what we've talked about today, and then some conclusions and future efforts, or a bit of a wrap up. So first of all, by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andrew Chapman. I'm an associate professor at I2CNER and also the Graduate School of Economics. Within I2CNER, I'm one of the principal investigators for energy analysis specifically within multi-scale science and engineering for energy and the environment, which is our incredibly long name, MSEEE. My research focus very pointedly is energy system analysis at the system level, social equity, my own personal research bent, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end as a bridging mechanism, and energy economics. To put it very simply, technology, people, systems, how they interact, how they interface, how we influence the system, how the system influences us, and how the technologies that we choose then feedback on what the future system will look like. Quick vision snapshot, just bringing together some of the technologies that have been talked about today and how energy analysis brings them into one basket. So everything from the energy supply, carbon dioxide management, energy efficiency, energy storage. And then I think we probably have two mutual or complementary approaches that we look at broadly. One, of course, is the ultimate end goal, which is the carbon neutral energy system itself. And I think linked very strongly with that is our interest in the hydrogen economy. Just a bit of a snapshot. So systems thinking, what do I mean when I'm talking about systems thinking? Today's workshop, I think you'll agree, has brought together experts from across energy materials, hydrogen, eddy conversion, and most recently carbon management, which I'll talk a little bit about in this presentation. These disciplines, there's no two ways about it. They are critical to achieving a carbon neutral energy system future. No one of them alone is going to be the ultimate solution. There's a combination here. While we often perform our research in isolation, it is also important to think of our research to step back from the nanometers, from the seismic observations, from the penetration and the selectivity of our membranes, and to think about what does that look like at the system level. When we bring all of those things together, what impact do they engender? So today I want to describe some of the specific research efforts in our energy analysis division, and also how we can think of these efforts systematically. The efforts I discuss are probably related to each thrust of I2CNER. The first of them is the hydrogen economy, which is, again, is very broad and encompasses lots of technologies, not just the conversion of primary energy to the secondary energy source, which is hydrogen. Of course, the deployment of renewables goes hand in hand with that. And I think this image, which we often co-opt in I2CNER, demonstrates that quite nicely, that renewable energy can be an electricity source on its own, but also as a conversion energy source for hydrogen. I'm going to talk about the role of CCS and other carbon management technologies. And finally, I want to talk about my own personal research, which uses social equity as a bridging metric to enable systems thinking. And I think that's important moving forward, how we shape society and how we shape that future energy society. So first of all, why do we use systems thinking, which gets into the research quite nicely? The main reason, I think, is because we are experiencing an energy transition, which is a shift from the current energy regime, whatever it looks like, mostly fossil fuels, some nuclear, and a little bit of renewables in Japan, and hopefully shifting to something which is dominated by a new energy regime, new sources. That comes from transition theory, and achieving 80% renewables in Japan might be difficult, but a combination of renewables, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, carbon management, and perhaps the hydrogen economy will give us that transition and a new energy regime. As I said before, there is no one solution to the energy transition. And in saying that, we could achieve it using just renewables, hydrogen, nuclear, CCS, but probably a combination.
So research efforts specifically, beginning with the hydrogen economy. At I2CNER and within energy analysis, we operate a global hydrogen model, which considers technology, carbon targets, and policy settings. It looks a little bit like this image that I've prepared here, where it takes primary energy, looks at CCS capture, secondary energy. We're most interested in gaseous fuels, i.e. hydrogen penetration, and everything from blending with city gas, automotive, conversion to electricity, and even secondary feedstocks like methanation and things like that, the model considers. And as you can see, it is a truly global model with 82 nodes across the globe. We think Japan is probably a high hydrogen use, and I'll talk a little about what that means in a minute. And recently, very recently, in the last year, we've adapted this global model to specifically look at Japan in light of people's preferences towards vehicle use, which I think is an interesting application. The reference I refer to at the bottom here is the global model. Our global model at the global level finds that in a maximum hydrogen penetration case, that about 2% of global energy can be met by hydrogen by 2050. Now, this seems like a small amount, but actually it means millions of FCVs and many other things. It's not, the number by itself is not impressive. Some countries don't use hydrogen, some countries produce it and don't use it, some countries consume it and don't produce it. So there are multiple permutations there. Japan, though, is a unique case. Our model suggests that hydrogen could underpin about 25% of energy needs by 2050. And as you can see, all of that hydrogen, I'll put the bullet point down here already, because you can already see that all of the hydrogen comes from overseas. There's no surprise there. We need to develop indigenous hydrogen generation capacity and learning curves to improve that outcome. But you can see it splits into about a half direct fired with electricity or co-burnt with natural gas, some conversion, and then a very large use case for transport and city gas. But our issue is, because the hydrogen is imported, only the end use we can claim as carbon dioxide free. So we need to think about that a little bit more. Building on stakeholder preferences toward future vehicle types, so working with some interesting outreach that Professor Itoga did, talking to people about their preferences for why they might choose a new vehicle, how they might use it, and what kind of infrastructure would need to be in place to refuel these vehicles. We looked at how that might influence the future FCV fleet, both in Japan and around the globe. And interestingly, although Japan, as you can see here, only uses 16% of the global transport hydrogen, the number of cars that emerge in Japan is higher than other jurisdictions. Now, this is because of the way that cars are driven in Japan, about 7,000 kilometers on average per year, whereas in the US, that's about 22 to 24,000 kilometers per year. So there's a big difference in the number of vehicles that are required. And some of this is related to energy efficiency, affordability, environmental friendliness, and refueling accessibility preferences. So Japan obviously is a special case. So one of the stretch targets where I work with people at UIUC, or University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where Petros is looking at nations which currently, according to our global model estimates, don't incorporate high levels of hydrogen. And among them, the USA is a future target. The USA, like Australia, like other resource-rich nations, doesn't need to rush to hydrogen as a bridging technology, and so it doesn't tend to uptake. But what we want to do is look at what would need to happen for that to happen, what would hydrogen usage look like, and maybe more importantly is what the pipeline requirements look like. And I think this is an opportunity to incorporate systems thinking between MSEEE, AEM, so our hydrogen infrastructure know-how, and international partners such as UIUC and others. Building on that and reflecting a little bit on what Professor Tsuji talked about, I2CNER has also a very strong candidates for carbon management. We talked about CCS, we talked about CCUNS, we talked about membranes, the hope for carbon negative approaches, and these geological or understanding the earth better. One of the key findings, and getting back to the linkages between these research, they don't operate in a vacuum, they're very strongly linked together. One of the key findings of our hydrogen economy model was that there's a massive need for CCS, whether it be enhanced oil recovery, enhanced coal bed methane, direct aquifer storage, under ocean storage, all of these things. It really needs to occur in large amounts. This is megatons of carbon, not megatons of carbon dioxide. So the numbers are actually much bigger if you're talking about tons of carbon that needs to be compressed. And so we see that emissions are predominantly coming from power generation, fossil and IGCC, as well as some chemicals. and that this carbon must be stored in gas wells, aquifers, and predominantly in the early stage, so out to 2050, used for ECBM. And it just suggests that we really need carbon management to start happening sooner rather than later. We identified CCS, and this is my own personal thinking, also influences some of this from some of the research that I've used, as a critical bridging technology. Obviously, we can't keep storing carbon indefinitely. That's an impossible thing, just like we can't keep using fossil fuels indefinitely. But we do need to have a bridging technology, or these technologies in place that allow us to get up to speed on our learning curves, our appropriate prices and competitiveness for fossil fuel, come hydrogen, come the other options that we will engage. So it is still absolutely critical. So our challenge is to balance carbon management technologies with conducive policy initiatives. So think things like carbon taxes, deployment timelines, and of course, combining with other technologies such as energy efficiency and reducing our carbon outputs in the first place. So what does that mean in terms of a challenge? The research that I'll talk about very briefly now is led by Professor Hoa, who is actually in our mathematics, augmenting I2CNER's work using mathematics for industry. And we did consider emissions trading and impacts of the cost of carbon on renewable energy deployment. So how these two things, again, link together, the linkages between our research. And what we found was just considering how much would carbon cost, or how much would carbon have to cost to engender deployment, investment rewarding deployment of renewable energy, wind and solar in Japan. And if we just went hell for leather and said, right, we're just going to have as much RE as is physically, economically feasible, it's expensive. But we can reduce CO2 by 42% in 46 of the 47 prefectures of Japan. We don't consider Okinawa. And payback periods are pretty good. 12 to 20 years is not bad, depending on the carbon price, which I'll talk about in just a second. However, if we seek a resilient energy system, that is to say we deploy the maximum amount of solar and wind that allows the most available energy, so not wasted, not sent to storage. So thinking about that balancing, we reduce the amount of CO2 that we can reduce in the whole country down to about 34%. But payback periods also increase. So it costs a bit less. The amount of CO2 we can reduce is slightly reduced, but payback periods increase. So we need to think about the dynamics, what we're actually trying to achieve. And we tested carbon taxes between $20 and $100 a ton, which we think is quite reasonable, considering even the current prices being explored and traded in Europe, in the US, and in other places. And so when we think about this, and again, back to those linkages, I know I'm banging on about this just a little bit, but what would the carbon price have to be to engender technologies like CCS or CCU? And I think that's the next logical link to look at, is not just to say, how could we encourage RE deployment, but how could we encourage a broad range of technology deployment to meet the carbon reduction needs? The thing that I've talked about consistently here, and it stands out to me, is the linkage between all of the possible technological responses to achieving carbon neutrality. We do not investigate the hydrogen economy in isolation. For example, it is contingent on renewable energy learning curves and the cost and deployment potential of CCS, fuel cells, infrastructure, and about 20,000 other variables, including economics and other things. But the problem that we face is that when we measure for sustainability of the various approaches in typical, and when I'm saying typical, I mean governments, not academic institutes, economic and environmental factors are always prioritized. And so we only get 2/3 of the sustainability picture. And that's why this slide is referring to social equity. And I think the current approach is not ideal, and neither is it holistic. So what we are trying to do in energy analysis is to use social equity as a bridging metric to evaluate energy systems and those scenarios. So what does that mean? This is just a very quick slide. I don't want to get into the detail because we are already well over time. Social equity is concerned with both the costs and benefits of energy technology diffusion and their distribution. And we can distribute them according to income, according to age, according to economic opportunity, a number of things, usually income. And what it helps us to do is to ask stakeholders, firstly, what's important to them? How are their lifestyles affected by energy systems? And how we then derive the economic, environmental, and social proxies which represent these issues that are important to them. So what we can do then is start to build a picture that is more holistic and is more reflective of what people are looking for in an energy system. Social equity calculations, in my opinion, are useful as they're holistic and based on all three pillars of sustainability, the environment, economy, and of course, society. Using this quantitative value methodology that I've developed over the last few years, we can determine not only the most effective set of technologies, but also those that will achieve a fair carbon neutral energy future. This approach is also useful. One of I2CNER's broader missions is to influence policy at the national and global level. It's also useful to help us extract those policy levers. So what kind of policies engender good outcomes and what kind of policies will retard our aspirations, and also identifying the currently very popular critical sustainable development goals which need immediate redress in the different jurisdictions. This is all I have for this presentation before I wrap up the whole session. And I hope that gives an overview of not only what we do in energy analysis, but how we're shifting and trying to incorporate new metrics and new measures to give a broader, more holistic view of what we're trying to achieve. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. So is there any questions or comment? Okay, Professor John, please.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting talk. Here in the UK, we have a slightly different, we're an island, but we're comparable to Japan. But the uptake of electric vehicles could make a huge difference to the scenario that you were talking about there, because now we can't do it at the moment, but we can have distributed storage. For instance, I've got a Tesla battery here. I'm off grid at the moment. It's been a sunny day here in London. But with my car, I've got about 80 kilowatt hours of storage. And if that's replicated, and it is up my street, about 5 or 6 houses have electric vehicles now, how would that impact the sort of analysis that you're talking about if we go straight from renewables to storage to electric vehicles?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I hope that my presentation didn't give the image that the only future we're looking at is a hydrogen future. Absolutely, the EV is as the hydrogen vehicle, as any vehicle is, as you just said, 80 kilowatt hours of electricity stored at your fingertips is a significant amount. By my estimates, probably 4 days worth of electricity for your household, at a guess. Look, EVs, in my opinion, are moving batteries. And if we can encourage a system which says that certain vehicles, short distance travel, for example, in Japan, what they call the kei car, are these moving batteries which can give back and take from the grid to balance intermittent renewables, absolutely, I would go for something like that. I think the bus and taxi case is also very strong because we know where those vehicles are and when they need to be charged and discharged. The only reservation that I have about incorporating EVs holus bolus into the grid is the effect on lifetime of the battery through the charge discharge cycle, and how stakeholders, as I said, stakeholders' opinions are very important in developing policy, how the stakeholders feel about what is a reasonable reward for a reduction in battery life, for example.
Yeah, I mean, they're also introducing, we've got agile tariffs here. So I can buy and sell electricity on a 30-minute period. I mean, I lose my feed-in tariff, but still, it's a very interesting way of managing the grid and managing a high proportion of renewables in your system.
No, that's really encouraging to hear. We do not have flexible tariffs in Japan, as I'm sure you're aware. But Dr. Hoa, who's our mathematics mathematician professor here, we often talk about what would it look like to have a more robust trading system for those shorter periods of time when we have excess and insufficient energy. And I think as someone who has solar panels on the roof above me now, yeah, my risk and reward is very static. It's very clinical and it's very cold. But yes, the energy system could be so much more with these kind of what we like to call enabling technologies, if you will. And I think that will change our analysis in a big way. Yeah. Thank you very much for those interesting points.
Okay. Petros, please.
Andrew, following up on the issue that John raised, everybody talks about the battery electric vehicles today, but I hear less about where this electricity will be produced and what is the effect on the CO2 emissions. Can you give us, of course, this is a big subject, can you give us a short answer here about the CO2 mitigation between battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen and the electric vehicles?
Wow, that's a really big question for 2:25 a.m. However, there's a couple of things I will touch on while avoiding most of that question. Look, they have their pros and cons. What I have heard and what I have researched suggests that battery vehicles have a kind of incumbent advantage in that even if they're sucking up fossil fuels now, the fact that an infrastructure gets in place means that as the grid grows and becomes greener, so therefore will the electricity that flows to these vehicles. That's my first point. The advantage for hydrogen vehicles is obviously the distance coefficient, the ability to be similar to a gasoline vehicle and something that people are comfortable with, perhaps. Mind you, when John said he had 80 kilowatt hours up his sleeve, I think, there's no sense of uncomfortableness there either. But the other thing that I'm concerned about with battery vehicles, Petros, is one of the things we struggle with, particularly in Japan, is resource management. So the need for specific metals, rare metals, lithium ion batteries in particular, if they shift to the NAS type batteries, or there's a different application that they can take. Often, when I talk to my students, I talk about alternatives that don't use rare metals. These are some of the big challenges. And in a country like Japan, they're going to be top of the list. So that's perhaps why I think, and I still stand by our analysis, that Japan probably is a special case.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
My pleasure.
Okay, is there any questions or comments? Okay, so if there is no more questions, so Professor Andrew will continue to wrap up this workshop.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. I prepared some slides for the wrap up. They're not important. I think the message is important. So just some closing remarks. I think you'll agree that we are all working in a very vibrant research area. And I would want to say that perhaps even in opportune times. Why do I think this? I have some confidence and some joy from watching recent events. As you know, Prime Minister Suga here in Japan has said, we will have a carbon neutral Japan by 2050. Now, of course, there are the nuts and bolts to come. The policies have to happen, the funding has to happen, the investment has to happen, but I2CNER is well positioned to take advantage of this. So I think we're in opportune times. From Petros' perspective, if I might step into his shoes just for a second, we saw even just yesterday, executive orders happening, rejoining global bodies and saying, yeah, we think the climate change issue is a real issue and we're gonna get involved in it. And as a scientist, I'm excited. As an academic, I'm more excited that more funding might be available and there might be bigger opportunities to link those two things. So I take a lot of joy from these things, and I think we are in opportune times. Look, I think we have the wind at our backs, and I think it's a great time to achieve what we want to achieve and a great time to progress our research. We're stuck indoors anyway. Cabin fever is kicking in for a lot of us, but we have our research and we're used to being in a room in front of a computer and bashing away at the keyboard. So let's keep working on that. Let's understand that research by its very nature is an individual activity. But I do encourage everyone, even though Zoom isn't that much fun, even though Skype is a bit crappy sometimes, is really reach out, keep those relationships in place, share your great findings. Together we achieve the breakthroughs required for a carbon neutral society, which is efficient, clean, and if I get my way, fair. That's really important to me. The last slide I don't want to read, but I just want to say, look, COVID has really thrown a spanner in the works, but we've proven today that that doesn't stop our ability to be together and do these things. I spent 6 months in the US this year. In fact, I just came home at the end of last year, towards the end of last year, and I spent those 6 months very close with Petros. And one of the things I realized in that time was there's a lot to be said for in-person research, which brings us together. And after we finish doing the presentations, we sit down, we have a cup of coffee, we have a beer, we go to dinner, and we talk about the unrelated things. These things are the glue of our research relationships. I honestly believe that. You know, some people call it the rabbit paddock. Some people call it, you know, the chat on the side, whatever it might be. I think those things really make up the mortar in between the bricks that is our research. So I want to really prepare ourselves for getting back to normal and reaping the benefits of being together, talking together, and doing all those things. Finally, I would be remiss not to thank everyone for staying up so late, for getting up so early, for being so available that we might achieve this workshop this morning, afternoon, and evening. And with that, I would like to wrap up and thank everybody. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And I appreciate many number of people are still staying in this workshop. And I think it suggests the great success of this workshop. So Petros, do you have any comment or any message at the end of this workshop?
Yes, it is too late.
In Japan, too late.
Yes, the only thing I would like to add, because Andrew summed up everything well. The workshop here was wonderful. It was a wonderful showcasing of I2CNER, how it will contribute to achieve what Prime Minister Suga has put forward. We are the enablers of that mission of Japan, the vision of Japan, and of course of the world, of our own President Biden. All I would say now, before closing, I thank my Japanese colleagues. Today, I realized that apart from the great scientific endeavors that we are undertaking in I2CNER, we are the most resilient people in the world. 3 o'clock, staying up to 3 o'clock to discuss science at such an advanced level in itself is an accomplishment. I thank you very much indeed. I thank everybody. And that's my last comment. I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now it is time to close this workshop. So I thank you again, all the people, and Masanobu and Takeshi is also thanking you, your participation. And I think it is a very good opportunity to share what is taking place, what we are. So we can utilize this experience for our future research and future activity with I2CNER. So thank you very much. So have a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hiroshige. Thank you.